Mercury pills and syrups. Imagine being sick in the 1800s, running a high fever, breaking out in rashes, and doctors telling you that you've got the French disease, what we now call syphilis. Back then, this was one of the most feared illnesses in the world. And guess what the go-to treatment was? Mercury. Yes, the shiny liquid metal inside thermometers. Doctors didn't just give you a little bit either. Mercury pills, mercury syrups, even mercury vapor baths were all the rage. You'd sit in a hot little tent while mercury was heated around you, and you'd inhale the vapors through your skin and lungs. The idea was simple. Mercury would purge the disease out of your body. It sounded scientific back then because mercury was seen as a strong cleanser, something that could rid you of whatever was corrupting your blood. And it kind of worked, but in the worst way possible. Mercury is extremely toxic, so yes, it would kill bacteria, but it was also slowly poisoning you. Patients started showing terrible side effects: drooling uncontrollably, teeth falling out, gums turning spongy and black, hands shaking so badly they couldn't write their own names. Some people went mad from mercury poisoning, literally losing their minds. But they stayed on the treatment because there was no other option. One of the most famous suspected mercury patients? Ludwig van Beethoven. Historians believe he may have been treated with mercury for syphilis, and some of his lifelong health problems, stomach issues, mood swings, even his death, may have been made worse by mercury exposure. He wasn't alone. For centuries, a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, was a grim joke among doctors. Basically, one fun night could leave you with syphilis, and the cure might kill you before the disease did. And mercury didn't just stay in your body quietly. It built up. Long-term patients developed what we'd now call heavy metal poisoning. Their skin would develop sores, their hair might fall out, and they'd waste away. Some doctors thought this was a good sign, proof the treatment was working. Imagine your teeth falling out and your doctor smiling, saying, "Good news, it's driving the disease out." Eventually, science caught up and realized mercury was causing more harm than good. By the early 20th century, it started getting phased out as better treatments came along, like salvarsan, an arsenic-based drug, still toxic but less so, and later penicillin. Looking back, mercury medicine is one of those terrifying reminders that people used to swallow and inhale literal poison because there were no other options. Next time you see mercury in a thermometer, just be glad no one is telling you to drink it to get better.
Arsenic wafers. Picture this. It's the late 1800s, and pale, delicate skin is the ultimate status symbol. Having a nice suntan meant you were probably out working in the fields all day, and no one wanted that. Rich, ghostly white skin was the look, and people would do almost anything to get it. Enter arsenic wafers. Yes, arsenic, as in the poison from every murder mystery ever written. These little beauty cookies were sold in fancy tins and advertised in women's magazines as a safe way to make your complexion clear, transparent, and luminous. The idea was that a tiny bit of arsenic would slow your skin's production of pigment and give you that flawless porcelain look. And honestly, they worked. Sort of. Arsenic can make skin appear paler, but that's because it was slowly shutting down parts of your body. These wafers were meant to be taken daily, so women, and even some men, were basically microdosing poison every single morning with breakfast. At first, users noticed a little glow, maybe fewer blemishes, but after a while, side effects kicked in. Nausea, stomach cramps, weird tingling in the hands and feet. And if they kept going, it got much worse. Chronic arsenic poisoning caused hair to fall out, fingernails to develop weird white lines, and skin to break out in dark spots, the exact opposite of the beauty effect they wanted. In severe cases, it damages the liver, causes paralysis, and could kill you. The scariest part? These wafers weren't sold as dangerous or handled with care. They were sold like candy. The ads featured elegant women with flawless faces, smiling at the camera, encouraging others to regain their youthful glow. Some brands even bragged that doctors approved of their product, which may have been true at the time, since arsenic was used in tiny amounts in some legitimate medicines. And here's the kicker. Some people got addicted. Not in the same way you'd get addicted to a drug like morphine, but psychologically. They felt they couldn't stop or their beauty would fade. Some women were taking them for years, slowly poisoning themselves just to keep up appearances. Eventually, public health authorities started catching on, and by the early 20th century, arsenic beauty products were being banned in most countries. But for decades, this was just normal. Your great-great-grandmother might have been nibbling poison wafers while gossiping with her friends about the latest fashion trends. It's wild to think that people were literally eating poison to look good. But then again, we still do risky things for beauty today. Tanning beds, crazy crash diets, injections we barely understand. Maybe we haven't changed that much. At least we're not sprinkling arsenic on our toast anymore.
Lead-laced makeup powders. If you thought arsenic wafers were bad, wait until you hear about this one. For hundreds of years, not just the 1800s, we're talking back to ancient Greece, Rome, and especially the European Renaissance. Women, and sometimes men, used face powders and creams made with white lead to get that perfect ghostly pale complexion. It was called Venetian ceruse, and it was the Instagram filter of the 1500s. Everyone wanted to look like they had flawless porcelain skin. Pale skin meant wealth, sophistication, and purity. So people powdered their faces, necks, and even their chests with lead-based makeup. At first, it did exactly what it promised. Covered blemishes, evened out the skin tone, and made you look ethereal. But here's the problem. Lead doesn't just sit harmlessly on top of the skin. It gets absorbed. Slowly but surely, it poisoned people from the outside in. Users started noticing their skin getting dry and irritated, but instead of stopping, they just applied more makeup to cover the damage, and that made it worse. It was a vicious cycle. The more your skin was ruined, the more makeup you needed, the more poison you got. Over time, the side effects became impossible to ignore. Teeth loosened, hair fell out, gums turned dark, and the skin under all that powder started literally rotting.
Some women developed sores so bad that pieces of skin were eaten away, leaving open wounds they kept covering with more lead powder. One of the most famous victims, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Portraits of her show her with that stark, white, mask-like face, and historians believe her skin was heavily damaged by years of using lead-based makeup. She may have even suffered lead poisoning symptoms like hair loss and mood swings later in life. And this wasn't just a European thing. Lead cosmetics were used all over the world. In Japan, women used a lead-based face paint called oshiroi, and in ancient Rome, lead powder was a status symbol. Everywhere the same thing happened. The quest for perfect beauty came with a deadly price tag. Doctors eventually figured out that lead was toxic, especially after seeing entire generations with mysterious neurological problems and stillbirths. But people were reluctant to stop using it. After all, what else could give you that perfectly smooth, pale look? By the 19th and early 20th centuries, safer, zinc-based and rice powders started replacing lead. But some lead powders were still being sold well into the 1900s. So yeah, next time you complain about a breakout from a cheap drugstore foundation, just be glad it isn't literally killing you. People back then were slowly poisoning themselves for the sake of fashion. And the scariest part is, they looked fabulous while doing it, right up until their skin started falling off.
Belladonna Drops. Here's a wild beauty hack from history. Imagine willingly putting poison in your eyes just to look more attractive. That's exactly what women did for centuries, using belladonna drops, an extract from the deadly nightshade plant. The name belladonna literally means beautiful woman in Italian, and for a while it was considered the ultimate beauty trick. Back in the Renaissance and even into the 1800s, big, dark, dilated pupils were seen as incredibly seductive. Think of that wide-eyed, dreamy look. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it, and women wanted it. So they used belladonna eye drops to chemically force their pupils wide open. At first glance, it worked. Their eyes looked darker, shinier, and almost hypnotic, perfect for catching the attention of some wealthy nobleman at a masquerade ball. But here's the problem. Belladonna is one of the most toxic plants in Europe. Its active compounds mess with the nervous system, and when you drip it into your eyes, it paralyzes the muscles that control your pupils. That's why the pupils stay wide open. But this wasn't just a temporary Instagram filter. The side effects were serious. Women who used it regularly started having blurry vision, dizziness, and extreme sensitivity to light. Imagine walking around in daylight with your pupils permanently dilated. It would feel like staring into the sun. And the longer they used it, the more damage was done. Some women actually went blind from using belladonna drops too often. And it wasn't just the eyes. Belladonna could be absorbed into the bloodstream and cause hallucinations, rapid heartbeat, and even death in high doses. But, as with a lot of historical beauty trends, people were willing to risk it because beauty was power. It could get you a husband, money, or social status. There are stories of women continuing to use belladonna even after going partially blind, because to them, looking attractive was worth more than being able to see clearly. That's how strong the pressure was to look desirable. Belladonna wasn't limited to beauty either. Doctors used it medicinally for centuries as a muscle relaxant and painkiller. But the cosmetic use is what really blows people's minds today. By the early 20th century, Belladonna Drops finally fell out of fashion, partly because science caught up, partly because there were safer ways to get that wide-eyed look, like makeup techniques or better lighting in portraits. Still, this is one of those terrifying reminders that people have always gone to extremes for beauty. Today, we might get fillers or colored contact lenses, but at least they don't leave you permanently blind. Well, usually.
Strychnine Tonics. You know that jittery feeling you got after one too many energy drinks? Now imagine that feeling dialed up to 11 with a side of muscle spasms because people used to literally drink rat poison for energy. No joke. Strychnine, the active ingredient in a lot of rat poisons, was once a go-to pick-me-up. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was sold in tonics and nerve stimulants for people who felt tired, run down, or weak. Doctors believed that in tiny doses, strychnine would stimulate the nervous system and give you energy. And technically they were right. It does stimulate the nerves. It just does it in a terrifying, almost violent way. People taking strychnine tonics reported feeling more alert, awake, and energized, but also shaky and restless. In higher doses, it caused full-body muscle convulsions, lockjaw, and terrifying seizures. And here's the kicker. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a deadly dose was ridiculously small. Taking just a little too much could mean the difference between feeling lively and dropping dead. There are stories of athletes in the early 20th century using strychnine as a kind of performance enhancer. One of the most famous cases was during the 1904 Olympic Marathon. An American runner named Thomas Hicks was given a mixture of egg whites, brandy, and strychnine by his trainers during the race to keep him going. He won the gold medal, but he was so close to death that he had to be carried across the finish line and nearly died right after. That's how powerful this stuff was. And yet, these tonics were marketed as safe. You could walk into a pharmacy and pick up a bottle promising to restore vitality and strengthen the nerves. There were even strychnine tablets recommended for business people who were mentally exhausted. Imagine needing a little boost to finish a report and just casually popping some rat poison like it's a vitamin. Over time, as more people started dying or developing horrific side effects, the medical world realized maybe this wasn't such a great idea. By the mid-20th century, strychnine was finally recognized as far too dangerous for casual use and was banned from over-the-counter tonics. Today, it's almost exclusively used as a pesticide, exactly where it belongs. Looking back, it's wild to think people trusted this stuff enough to put it in their bodies. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and people in the past were willing to try anything to feel less tired, even if it meant dancing on the edge of death.
Antimony pills. This one might be one of the weirdest medical habits in history, and also one of the most disturbing. Imagine taking a pill, waiting for it to literally pass all the way through your digestive system, fishing it back out, yes, from where you think, cleaning it off, and taking it again the next day. Welcome to the world of Antimony Pills, also known as everlasting pills. Antimony is a toxic metal, similar to arsenic, and for centuries it was used as a purgative, basically a medicine that made you vomit or have diarrhea. Doctors back in the 17th and 18th centuries believed that cleaning out the body was the key to health. So they'd prescribe these solid metal antimony pills to balance the humors or purge bad bile. The pill itself didn't dissolve. It just irritated your stomach and intestines enough to cause a very dramatic reaction. And once it did its job, it came out the other end intact. People would wash it off, sometimes polish it, and keep using it again and again. Some families even passed them down from one generation to the next, like a family heirloom. Here, son, this is the pill that kept your grandfather healthy for 40 years. Don't lose it. And here's where it gets even scarier. Antimony isn't just a harmless little metal bead. Over time, tiny amounts of the metal would leach into the body, slowly poisoning whoever was using it. Symptoms of antimony poisoning included vomiting, no surprise there, stomach pain, dizziness, and in severe cases, liver failure and death. But because those early symptoms looked like the purging that doctors wanted, people thought it meant the medicine was working. There are historical accounts of people swearing by these pills, saying they could feel their sickness leaving their body. And yes, they were definitely feeling something leave their body, but in reality, they were just irritating their digestive tract over and over, weakening themselves in the long run. Eventually, as medicine became more scientific and less about balancing humors, antimony pills fell out of favor. By the 19th century, they were mostly abandoned, though some remote communities purportedly kept using them well into the Victorian era. Today, the idea of reusing a single pill for years feels disgusting, not to mention dangerous. Still, you have to admit there's something darkly fascinating about these pills. They were called everlasting because they never wore out, but in a way, they kind of did. They wore you out. One little metal bead could ruin your insides over a lifetime.
Chloral Hydrate. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-1800s and you can't sleep. Maybe you're stressed, maybe you're anxious, maybe life is just too noisy. Then along comes a doctor offering you a miracle solution. Chloral Hydrate. One tiny dose, they promise, and you'll drift into peaceful, dreamless sleep. And you would. Chloral Hydrate was one of the very first prescription sedatives, and it worked fast. It knocked people out within 30 minutes, and for a while it was hailed as a medical breakthrough. Doctors prescribed it for insomnia, anxiety, even pain. It was mixed into syrups, drops, and powders. And pretty soon, it became the thing to take if you couldn't sleep. But here's the dark side. Chloral Hydrate was very habit-forming. People who took it night after night built up tolerance quickly, meaning they needed bigger and bigger doses to get the same effect. Before long, they weren't just taking it to sleep, they were taking it to function at all. Stop taking it suddenly, and you'd experience withdrawal symptoms like shaking, nausea, hallucinations, and crippling anxiety. And there's more. Long-term use of chloral hydrate could wreck your health. It was harsh on the liver and kidneys, caused stomach irritation, and in high enough doses, it could straight up kill you by stopping your breathing. But because it was so effective at calming the nerves, people kept using it. It even developed a reputation outside of medicine. If you've ever heard the phrase Mickey Finn, the classic slang for a spiked drink, Chloral Hydrate was the original knockout drug bartenders or criminals would slip into someone's drink to render them unconscious. There are documented cases in the late 1800s and early 1900s of thieves using it to rob unsuspecting victims. Writers and artists also got hooked on it. The famous author, Wilkie Collins, who wrote The Women in White, became so addicted to chloral hydrate that he claimed he sometimes saw ghosts when he wasn't taking it. It's not hard to see why. Withdrawal from chloral hydrate could cause vivid hallucinations and delirium. By the early 20th century, doctors were starting to realize that maybe this wonder drug wasn't so wonderful. Safer sleeping pills and barbiturates started replacing it. But chloral hydrate never fully went away. In fact, it stayed in use for decades, even into the late 20th century, mostly in hospitals for short-term sedation. Today, it's rarely used, but the story of chloral hydrate is a reminder that just because something works doesn't mean it's safe. This was one of the first times humanity got a taste of modern pharmacology and learned the hard way that miracle drugs can turn into monsters if you rely on them too much.
Radium-Infused Elixirs. Imagine walking into a fancy pharmacy in the 1920s and being offered a health drink that literally glows in the dark. Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? Well, it actually happened. People were lining up to buy radium-infused elixirs, drinks laced with radioactive material, because they thought it would make them healthier, stronger, and maybe even younger. It all started when Marie and Pierre Curie discovered radium in the late 1800s. The world became obsessed with this mysterious glowing element. Scientists were fascinated by its strange energy, and soon the public wanted a piece of the magic. Companies wasted no time marketing radium as the ultimate health booster. If something glowed, it must be powerful, right? One of the most infamous products was Radithor, a little bottle of radioactive water sold as a revitalizing tonic. Ads promised it would give you endless energy, cure fatigue, and even increase virility. And at first, users swore they felt better. Maybe because radium does stimulate certain cells, but what they didn't know was that it was slowly destroying them from the inside out. The most famous victim was Eben Byers, a wealthy industrialist and golfer. He loved Radithor so much that he reportedly drank over 1,400 bottles of the stuff. At first, he claimed it made him feel unstoppable. Then things started going very, very wrong. His jawbone literally began disintegrating. Holes formed in his skull. Doctors eventually had to remove most of his jaw, but by then, his entire body was so radioactive that when he finally died in 1932, they buried him in a lead-lined coffin. And Byers wasn't alone. Other regular users developed anemia, bone fractures, and cancer. Some of them glowed faintly in the dark. Not metaphorically, but literally. Their bones were storing the radium like calcium, and it was slowly cooking them from the inside out. What makes this story even creepier is that radium wasn't just in drinks. It was in toothpaste, chocolate, cosmetics, even children's toys. People painted watch dials with radium so they'd glow at night, and the factory workers, mostly young women, would lip point their brushes, shaping them with their mouths. Many of those women later developed horrific jaw necrosis, which became known as radium jaw. Eventually, after enough high-profile deaths, the public realized maybe glowing drinks weren't such a great idea. Regulations finally cracked down in the 1930s, and radium tonics disappeared from store shelves. But for a while, drinking radiation was the ultimate status symbol. So yeah, next time someone tries to sell you a miracle wellness drink, just remember people once happily paid top dollar to glow in the dark, right up until it killed them.
Thallium sulfate hair removers. If you think modern beauty treatments go too far, wait until you hear this one. In the early 20th century, some companies sold hair removal products that used thallium sulfate, a chemical that just happens to be one of the most poisonous substances on Earth, and people were rubbing it on their skin. Here's how it worked. Thallium is a metal that messes with hair follicles by interfering with how cells divide. If you apply it to the skin, the hair stops growing and eventually falls out. Sounds perfect if you're tired of plucking or shaving, right? That's what made it such a hit. These creams and powders were marketed as miracle depilatories, promising silky smooth arms, legs, and even faces. But here's the terrifying catch. Thallium doesn't just stay on the surface. It soaks into your skin and travels through your bloodstream. And once it's in your body, it attacks the nervous system. At first, users might notice a little tingling in their fingers and toes. Then came the muscle weakness, stomach pain, and severe fatigue. If they kept using it, it could lead to partial paralysis, blindness, and eventually, death. The worst part is that thallium poisoning was slow, which meant that by the time you realized something was wrong, it was too late. Hair falling out wasn't just happening where you applied the cream. It started coming out in clumps all over your head. Some people who used these products reported going completely bald within weeks. And this wasn't some shady back alley scam either. Thallium hair removers were sold by legitimate pharmaceutical companies in places like the United States, Europe, and South America. They were even used medically to treat ringworm on the scalp because they were so effective at making hair fall out. Doctors thought removing the hair would help treat the infection. Eventually, the side effects became impossible to ignore. Reports started pouring in of women collapsing, going blind, or dying after repeated use. In one notorious case in the 1930s, several women in California died after using a thallium-based depilatory, sparking public outrage and pushing regulators to act. Today, thallium is mostly known as a favorite poison in true crime stories, tasteless, odorless, and almost impossible to detect until symptoms appear. But back then, people were willingly rubbing it on their bodies in the name of beauty. It's a creepy reminder that not every miracle cosmetic is your friend. These days, we complain if a hair removal cream just smells bad or causes a little rash. 100 years ago, it might have left you paralyzed or in a coffin.
Phenacetin Painkillers. You know how we all have that one go-to painkiller we grab when we get a headache? In the early and mid-1900s, that miracle pill for millions of people was phenacetin. It was sold everywhere. in pharmacies, in grocery stores, sometimes even in vending machines. And it promised quick relief from headaches, cramps, fevers, and just about any other ache you could imagine. And here's the thing. Phenacetin worked. People loved it because it kicked in fast and really did dull the pain. It became a trusted household name, especially in combination tablets mixed with caffeine and aspirin. Popular brands made a fortune selling it as a daily fix for busy workers, tired moms, and anyone who just wanted to keep going. But there was a dark secret hiding in those little pills. Over time, doctors started noticing a strange pattern. Patients who took phenacetin regularly were showing up with serious kidney damage. We're talking shrunken kidneys, kidney failure, and even a particular type of cancer called transitional cell carcinoma in the renal pelvis. And this wasn't just heavy users. Even moderate long-term use was risky. The problem was that phenacetin is metabolized in the body into a compound that's really harsh on the kidneys. So while you might have felt fine after popping a few pills for a headache, you were silently damaging the very organs responsible for filtering waste out of your blood. Some people even developed something called analgesic nephropathy. Basically, their kidneys were so scarred from years of painkiller use that they stopped working properly. And yet, despite these risks, phenacetin stayed on the market for decades. It was cheap, it worked, and people trusted it. Even after researchers raised alarms in the 1950s and 1960s, it wasn't banned right away. In fact, in some countries, it stayed available into the 1980s and 1990s. By then, we already had safer alternatives like acetaminophen or Tylenol. But old habits die hard, and a lot of people swear by their favorite phenacetin brands. It wasn't until enough studies linked phenacetin to kidney damage and bladder cancer that most governments finally pulled the plug. The World Health Organization classified it as a carcinogen, and now it's basically gone from pharmacies worldwide. Looking back, it's a little scary to think that a painkiller so widely trusted was quietly destroying people's health. It's also a reminder that safe medicine isn't always safe, especially when taken daily for years. So next time you grab something for a headache, remember, we're lucky to live in a time where painkillers are a lot safer than they used to be. But history shows that it can take decades to figure out what's really harmful. So maybe don't make painkillers your go-to snack.
Cocaine toothache drops. This one might be one of the most jaw-dropping medicines ever sold, literally. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when your baby was teething and crying all night, you couldn't just run to the pharmacy for baby Tylenol. But you could buy something much stronger, cocaine toothache drops. Yes, you read that right. Cocaine, as in the same drug that is now illegal in almost every country, was sold over the counter to calm teething babies. It was marketed as the perfect solution for fussy kids, promising to numb the gums, stop the crying, and give parents a peaceful night's sleep. And to be fair, it worked exactly as advertised. Cocaine is an incredibly powerful local anesthesia. Dab a little on the gums, and the pain goes away almost instantly. The baby stops screaming. Everyone gets to sleep. Problem solved, right? Except, not really.
Cocaine doesn't just numb pain. It also stimulates the central nervous system, raises heart rate, and gives a burst of energy. So some babies, instead of just calming down, would get restless, hyper, and wide-eyed in the middle of the night. Others would eventually crash hard, sometimes dangerously so, because cocaine can depress breathing when it wears off. And it wasn't just toothache drops. In that era, cocaine was everywhere. Cough syrups, nerve tonics, even drinks like the original Coca-Cola. Parents genuinely thought they were doing something good for their kids. After all, these products were endorsed by doctors, and there were no warning labels back then. But, as you might imagine, the side effects were serious. Repeated use could cause irritability, poor sleep, appetite loss, and in some cases, convulsions. There are even documented cases of accidental overdoses in infants. The doses weren't exactly precise. You were basically guessing how many drops to use, so it was easy to give too much. By the early 20th century, as medicine became more regulated, doctors and public health officials started raising alarms about cocaine in children's products. Slowly but surely, cocaine toothache drops disappeared from shelves, replaced by safer and much less exciting pain relievers like clove oil and eventually modern anesthetic gels. It's shocking to think about today. Imagine going to the store, buying a tiny bottle of cocaine, and being told to rub it on your baby's gums, no questions asked. But at the time, it was considered progressive medicine. So next time you hear a baby crying at 2 a.m. and you're tempted to complain, just be glad you're not in the 1890s, casually drugging your kid with one of the most addictive substances on the planet, just so everyone in the house can get some sleep.
Heroin cough syrup. Picture yourself in the late 1800s. You've got a bad cough, maybe tuberculosis, maybe just a nasty cold, and nothing seems to help. Then your doctor hands you a shiny little bottle of medicine with the reassuring label, heroin. Yep, actual heroin, in syrup form, proudly advertised as a safe, non-addictive cure for coughs. It sounds completely insane today, but this was real. In 1898, the pharmaceutical giant Bayer, yes, the same Bayer that still makes aspirin, started producing heroin commercially. They were looking for a safer, less addictive alternative to morphine, which had been widely used for pain but was causing a major addiction crisis after the Civil War. Bayer's scientists modified morphine's chemical structure and ended up with diacetylmorphine, which they branded as heroin. And to be fair, it worked. Heroin was a powerful cough suppressant. In fact, it was even more effective than codeine at silencing coughs, which made it perfect for treating diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia that caused hacking, painful coughing fits. Doctors loved it, patients loved it, and because it was marketed as a gentle option, people thought it was totally safe, even for children. There were children's versions of heroin cough syrup sold over the counter. But here's the catch. Heroin wasn't just as addictive as morphine, it was actually more addictive. People who started taking it for a cough found themselves unable to stop, even after the cough went away. Some began upping their doses just to feel normal. Withdrawal symptoms were brutal, and soon entire communities were facing a new drug problem. By the early 1900s, public health authorities were alarmed. Hospitals were filling up with heroin fiends, as they were called back then, people who were hooked on what was supposed to be a safe medicine. It quickly became clear that Bayer's miracle drug had created a new epidemic. By 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which restricted the sale of heroin, and by the 1920s, it was banned completely for medical use in many countries. Bayer quietly stopped producing it, and today, heroin is illegal almost everywhere, though it's still used as a prescription painkiller in a few places under the name diamorphine. Looking back, this is one of those moments in medical history that feels almost too wild to be true. A major pharmaceutical company accidentally introduced one of the most addictive substances in the world and sold it as a family-friendly medicine. So yeah, next time you see a bottle of cough syrup at the pharmacy, be thankful that the worst thing in it is usually a little sugar or alcohol, not a drug that could leave you physically dependent after just a few doses.
Opium infant soothing syrups. This one might be the most chilling of all, because it was aimed at the most vulnerable people on the planet, babies. In the 1800s and early 1900s, being a parent was exhausting. Babies cried through the night, teethed painfully, got colicky, and there were no baby monitors, no sleep training guides, no Netflix to keep you sane at 3 a.m. But there was a miracle solution: soothing syrups. These were widely sold under names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup and Godfrey's Cordial, and they were marketed as the perfect way to calm a fussy baby. The ads promised quiet nights for mothers and happy, peaceful babies. Sounds great until you looked at the ingredients. These syrups were loaded with opium. Yes, the same drug that heroin and morphine are derived from. The opium would knock the baby out, stop the crying, and give parents a break. And it worked frighteningly well. Babies would go from wailing to completely silent, sometimes for hours. But here's the terrifying part. Opium also slowed breathing. Many babies stopped crying because they were literally sedated into unconsciousness. Some never woke up. Infant mortality was already high in that era, but soothing syrups made it worse. There are reports of entire families losing multiple children after regular use of these products. And this wasn't just a fringe thing. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was advertised everywhere, in newspapers, magazines, and on posters. The ads even had cute little rhymes and drawings of smiling babies, reassuring parents that this was a loving, responsible thing to do. Over time, doctors and public health officials began to realize what was happening. Coroners noticed babies dying with alarming regularity after being given these syrups. Some were literally overdosing because the doses weren't carefully measured. Just a spoonful here, a spoonful there, whenever the baby cried too much.
By the early 20th century, medical journals started calling out these products as dangerous, and campaigns were launched to have them banned. By the 1930s, many of the worst offenders were pulled from the market, and stricter regulations were put in place, requiring ingredients to be listed on labels. But the fact that these syrups were ever sold in the first place is a grim reminder of how desperate parents were, and how little oversight there was over medicine at the time. People trusted the label, trusted the company, and had no idea they were slowly poisoning their kids. So next time you hear a baby screaming and feel like you'd do anything to make it stop, remember that parents in the past really did, and the result was a tragedy that changed the way we regulate children's medicine forever.
Vin Mariani. Imagine walking into a cafe in Paris in the late 1800s and ordering a glass of wine. But not just any wine. This one has an extra kick. Cocaine. Welcome to the world of Vin Mariani, the drink that was so popular it became the favorite pick-me-up of celebrities, writers, royals, and yes, even the Pope. Vin Mariani was the brainchild of a French chemist named Angelo Mariani. He had the clever idea to soak coca leaves, the same leaves used to make cocaine, in Bordeaux wine. The alcohol extracted the cocaine from the leaves, creating a drink that gave you a mild buzz from the wine and a stimulating lift from the cocaine. The result? Instant popularity. People loved it because it made them feel alert, happy, and energized without the heavy drunkenness of regular wine. It was marketed as a tonic for fatigue, depression, and general malaise. Ads claimed it could help digestion, sharpen the mind, and boost creativity. And judging by the fan base, maybe it did. Here's the wild part. Vin Mariani had endorsements that would make modern advertisers jealous. Thomas Edison reportedly drank it while working on inventions. Jules Verne, the science fiction writer, was a fan. Even Pope Leo XIII gave it his blessing, literally. He awarded Angelo Mariani a Vatican gold medal and had his face appear in ads for the wine. There's even a story that the Pope carried a flask of Vin Mariani with him and took sips throughout the day to keep up his energy. Of course, there was a darker side. Regular drinkers started to depend on it, because cocaine, even in small doses, is addictive. And since this was before anyone fully understood the risks of cocaine use, people were drinking it freely, sometimes daily. Over time, it could cause irritability, insomnia, heart problems, and severe dependence. But for a while, it was the hottest drink in Europe and America. Its popularity even inspired copycats, including a little American beverage that eventually became Coca-Cola, which originally contained cocaine too, though in smaller amounts. By the early 1900s, as cocaine's addictive potential became better understood, Vin Mariani and other cocaine wines began to fall out of favor. Regulations tightened, and by the 1920s, cocaine was banned from most consumer products. Angelo Mariani's creation faded into history, but not before leaving behind one of the most fascinating "What were they thinking?" chapters in medical history.
So yes, there was a time when drinking wine laced with cocaine wasn't just socially acceptable, it was fashionable. The Pope did it. Edison did it. Maybe even your great-great-grandparents did it. And the best part? They probably thought it was the secret to a long, healthy life.
Amphetamine diet pills. If you've ever heard someone joke that they need a pill to make them stop eating, well, once upon a time, those pills actually existed, and they were basically pure speed. In the 1930s, scientists first synthesized amphetamines and quickly realized they had some miraculous effects. They suppressed appetite, gave people energy, and boosted their mood. It didn't take long before pharmaceutical companies saw dollar signs. By the 1940s and especially the 1950s, amphetamine diet pills were being handed out like candy to anyone who wanted to slim down. Doctors prescribed them to housewives who wanted to lose baby weight, to businessmen who complained of fatigue, even to teenagers. They were marketed under names like Benzedrine and Dexedrine and advertised in glamorous magazines, promising to take off pounds effortlessly while giving you the pep to get through your day. And in a way, they worked exactly as advertised. People taking these pills often lost weight quickly, but they also became jittery, anxious, and sleepless. Because amphetamines don't just kill your appetite, they crank up your entire nervous system. Many users would feel wired for hours, cleaning their entire house at 3 a.m. or talking nonstop. But the side effects didn't stop there. Some users became psychologically dependent, taking higher and higher doses just to get the same effect. Long-term use could lead to heart palpitations, paranoia, and even psychosis, basically a drug-induced mental breakdown. There's stories from the 1960s of women who started with a few pills a day and ended up taking handfuls, unable to stop, their health completely wrecked. It got so bad that the government eventually had to step in. By the 1970s, amphetamine diet pills were being restricted because they were fueling a massive addiction problem. Black market speed became a serious issue, and suddenly, the miracle weight loss drug was seen as a public health crisis. And yet, even today, amphetamines haven't completely disappeared from medicine cabinets. They're still used in much safer, controlled doses for conditions like ADHD and narcolepsy. And some modern prescription weight loss drugs are chemically related to those early diet pills, though they're much more regulated. Looking back, this whole era is wild. Imagine going to your doctor to ask for help losing 10 pounds and being handed a bottle of what is essentially pharmaceutical-grade meth. People really did think this was just a safe, simple solution. So the next time you see a commercial for some trendy weight loss shot or supplement, remember, we've been chasing easy weight loss for almost a century. The difference is that back then, the solution was to just crank your body into overdrive, even if it meant putting your mind and heart at serious risk.
Laudanum. Imagine walking into a pharmacy in Victorian England with a headache, a bad back, maybe a bit of melancholy, and walking out with a single bottle that promises to fix it all. That bottle was laudanum, and for over a century it was the go-to remedy for just about everything.
Laudanum was simple but powerful, a mix of opium and alcohol. That's right, one of the most addictive substances on earth mixed with liquor, sold over the counter like cough syrup. It was marketed as a treatment for headaches, stomach cramps, coughs, menstrual pain, insomnia, even the vague, nervous troubles that doctors liked to diagnose in the 1800s. And people loved it. Why wouldn't they? Take a spoonful and suddenly your pain fades, your anxiety eases, and you feel calm, even euphoric. It was cheap, easy to get, and didn't carry the social stigma that harder drugs would later have. Mothers gave it to crying babies to help them sleep. Workers took it after long shifts, and artists and writers swore by it for inspiration. Some of history's most famous creatives were regular users. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote his famous poem Kubla Khan while under the influence of laudanum. Charles Dickens reportedly used it for insomnia. It became so common that it wasn't unusual for an entire household to have a bottle in the medicine cabinet right next to the flour and sugar. But there was a dark side. Laudanum was highly addictive, though people didn't fully understand addiction at the time. Regular users started needing more and more just to feel normal. Some became so dependent that they couldn't get through the day without it. And because it was basically unregulated, overdoses were frighteningly common. Even worse, there was no standard recipe for laudanum. One bottle might be much stronger than another, depending on who made it. This meant you never really knew how much opium you were taking. Some people would accidentally give themselves a double or triple dose and slip into unconsciousness. For babies and children, even a small amount could be deadly. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as science advanced, the dangers of laudanum became impossible to ignore. Regulations started requiring opium-containing products to be labeled, and eventually laudanum was restricted to prescription-only use. It never fully disappeared. Some doctors still prescribed it for severe diarrhea or pain, but its golden age as a household cure-all was over. Today, laudanum is mostly a historical curiosity, but its story is a reminder of how entire generations once lived under the quiet haze of a drug they thought was just medicine. Imagine being a Victorian parent dosing the whole family with laudanum before bed, thinking you were helping, when in reality, you were slowly getting everyone addicted.
Ketamine lozenges. If you've heard of ketamine today, you probably think of two things. It's either a surgical anesthetic or a party drug that shows up in club stories. But before it earned its reputation in operating rooms and rave scenes, ketamine had a surprisingly tame beginning as a cough medicine. Back in the 1960s, ketamine was a brand new drug. Scientists had just discovered it as a safer alternative to PCP. Yes, that PCP, the hallucinogen known for making people do wild things. Because ketamine could dull pain, relax the body, and put patients into a trance-like state without stopping their breathing, doctors thought they'd hit the jackpot. It was approved as an anesthetic and became a favorite in surgeries, especially for kids and battlefield medicine. But here's where it gets strange. Some pharmaceutical companies decided to market it in very small doses as a lozenge for persistent coughs. The logic was that ketamine's ability to suppress reflexes including the cough reflex, would calm down those hacking fits. Imagine going to the pharmacy and buying a ketamine cough drop like it was a cherry-flavored candy. At first, it probably felt like a miracle. Your throat relaxed, your cough quieted, and you might have even felt pleasantly floaty for a little while. But ketamine is a powerful drug, even in small doses. Some users reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, almost like they were watching themselves from a distance, a phenomenon we now call dissociation. Not exactly what you want from your afternoon throat lozenge. And of course, ketamine can be addictive. People started noticing that these miracle cough drops made them feel strangely good, relaxed, dreamy, and a little detached from stress. Some users kept taking them long after their cough went away, chasing that floaty feeling. Eventually, regulators realized this probably wasn't the safest thing to be selling over the counter. Ketamine lozenges quietly disappeared from the consumer market and went back to being strictly controlled in hospitals. Today, ketamine is making a comeback in a very different way. In highly controlled clinical settings, it's used as a treatment for severe depression and PTSD. But you definitely won't find it in the cough drop aisle anymore. Looking back, the idea of sucking on a ketamine lozenge while you go about your day feels wild. Imagine being at work, chewing on what you think is just a cough drop, and suddenly feeling like your desk chair is floating 3 feet off the ground. So next time you grab a menthol lozenge for a sore throat, just be glad it won't send you on a mini psychedelic journey. The history of ketamine shows that sometimes medicine is a little too effective at making you forget your problems, including the problem you bought it for the first place.
Bromide Sedatives. If you've ever had a few nights of terrible sleep, you know how tempting it is to reach for something, anything, that promises to knock you out. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, that something was bromides. Bromides were among the very first widely used sedatives in Western medicine. They were made from salts containing bromine, and doctors handed them out like candy for insomnia, anxiety, and even epilepsy. You could get them in tablets, powders, or drops, and they were considered a safe, gentle way to calm the nervous system. And at first, they worked beautifully. People who had been sleepless for days finally got rest. Patients with seizures seemed calmer. Bromides became so popular that by the early 20th century, they made up nearly half of all prescriptions in some countries. It was the Victorian version of Ambien, just with a much creepier twist. The problem was that bromides don't just relax you, they hang around in your body. If you kept taking them regularly, the levels built up until you started showing symptoms of bromism, a type of chronic poisoning. The first sign was usually mental fog. People became slow, forgetful, and struggled to concentrate. Friends and family noticed personality changes. Someone once cheerful might become irritable or withdrawn. Then came the physical symptoms: skin rashes, tremors, slurred speech. In severe cases, people experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and full-blown psychosis. Imagine trying to treat your insomnia and slowly turning into a shell of yourself, losing touch with reality, and no one realizing it was the medicine doing it. Some patients were even institutionalized because their doctors thought they'd gone insane, when really they were just overdosed on bromides. Despite all of this, bromides stayed in use for decades because there weren't many alternatives. People were desperate for relief, and for many, the choice was between being a zombie or being completely sleepless. Some doctors even believed the dullness and apathy bromides caused were a good thing for hysterical or overexcited patients. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, when barbiturates and later benzodiazepines came along, that bromides finally started to disappear from medicine cabinets. Today, they're rarely used outside of very specific treatments for severe seizures, and even then, doctors monitor patients extremely closely. The story of bromides is a perfect example of how medicine sometimes trades one problem for another. Yes, they helped people sleep and quieted anxious minds, but at the cost of slowly erasing people's personalities and mental clarity. So next time you have trouble sleeping and complain about how mild melatonin is, just be grateful your modern sleep aid isn't turning you into a confused, hallucinating Victorian ghost of yourself.
Lobotomy. This one might be the most disturbing of all, because it wasn't just a pill or a syrup, it was surgery. For a few shocking decades in the mid-20th century, doctors were performing lobotomies, literally cutting into people's brains as a cure for everything from anxiety to depression and even for behavior that was just considered difficult. The lobotomy was invented in the 1930s by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, who believed that many mental illnesses were caused by overactive brain circuits. His solution? Sever the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. In theory, this would calm patients and reduce distressing thoughts. And incredibly, it worked, at least on the surface. Patients often became calmer after the procedure. But the price was huge. They also lost parts of their personality. Many became emotionally flat, childlike, or unable to plan and make decisions. Things really took off in the United States when Dr. Walter Freeman popularized the so-called ice pick lobotomy. This method involved sliding a surgical instrument, sometimes literally an ice pick, through the corner of the patient's eye socket and swiping it back and forth to cut the brain connections. It was quick, cheap, and didn't even require a full operating room. Freeman would sometimes perform dozens in a single day, even on children as young as 12. And here's the terrifying part. Lobotomies weren't just for severe mental illness. People were lobotomized for postpartum depression, alcoholism, chronic pain, or simply being hard to manage. There are documented cases of women sent in by their husbands because they were too emotional or rebellious. At first, there were glowing newspaper articles about how this miracle surgery cured mental illness, but the reality behind the scenes was grim. Some patients were left in a near vegetative state, unable to care for themselves. Others developed seizures or died from brain hemorrhages. Families sometimes regretted the decision immediately, but there was no undoing it. One of the most famous cases was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy.
She was given a lobotomy at age 23 because her parents worried about her mood swings and behavior. The procedure left her with severe cognitive disabilities, and she spent the rest of her life in institutional care. By the 1950s and 60s, as antipsychotic medications like Thorazine became available, lobotomies fell out of favor. The medical community gradually recognized how brutal and irreversible the procedure was, and today it's considered one of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history. It's hard to imagine a time when sticking a metal rod into someone's brain was seen as compassionate medicine, but it's a sobering reminder of just how far people were willing to go in the desperate search for mental health cures.
Insulin coma therapy. If you think psychiatric treatments were intense back in the lobotomy era, wait until you hear this one. In the 1930s and 40s, one of the hottest new treatments for schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses was something called insulin coma therapy, and it was exactly what it sounds like. The idea came from a doctor named Manfred Sackel, who noticed that some diabetic patients who accidentally overdosed on insulin and went into a coma seemed calmer and less agitated when they woke up. He had a radical thought. What if we did this on purpose as a form of therapy? And so insulin coma therapy was born. Patients were given massive doses of insulin to drop their blood sugar so low that they would lose consciousness, sometimes for hours. Their bodies would go into a deep coma, and often they'd experience violent seizures as their brains struggled to cope with the lack of glucose. After a while, doctors would revive them with a dose of glucose or adrenaline. Then they'd do it all again the next day. These treatments were repeated 5 to 6 times a week for weeks or even months. The goal was to reset the brain and somehow reduce psychotic symptoms. At first, doctors thought they had discovered a miracle. Some patients really did seem to improve. They were calmer, more responsive, sometimes even able to leave the hospital. But here's the scary part. Insulin coma therapy was incredibly dangerous. Patients sometimes didn't wake up at all. Others suffered brain damage from repeated seizures or fell into a state of confusion that never went away. Even when the procedure was successful, the improvements often didn't last long. Despite the risks, insulin comas became a standard treatment in psychiatric hospitals all over the world in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. Special insulin wards were created, where rows of patients would be lying in beds, monitored by nurses as they slipped in and out of chemically induced comas day after day. As you can imagine, it wasn't exactly pleasant. Some former patients later described the therapy as terrifying. They would wake up drenched in sweat, confused, and sometimes injured from thrashing during seizures. But because there weren't many effective treatments for schizophrenia at the time, doctors believed the risks were worth it. By the late 1950s, the arrival of antipsychotic drugs like chlorpromazine made insulin coma therapy obsolete. It quickly fell out of favor and is now considered one of psychiatry's most extreme and dangerous experiments. Looking back, insulin coma therapy feels like something out of a horror movie, a treatment so intense it sounds cruel. But it's also a reminder of how desperate doctors were to find anything that could help patients with severe mental illness, even if it meant pushing the human body to the absolute brink. Trepanation Kits. Okay, this one sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was real. Trepanation is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history, going back thousands of years. The idea is simple but terrifying. You drill a hole into the skull to release pressure, treat headaches, or even let out evil spirits. For most of history, this was done by trained healers or surgeons, if you can call someone with a hand-crank drill trained. But by the late 1800s and early 1900s, something strange happened. Home trepanation kits started showing up for sale. Yes, regular people could buy a kit, take it home, and perform skull surgery on themselves or a family member. The kits usually included a hand-powered drill called a trepine, some antiseptic, if you were lucky, and instructions. They were marketed as a way to treat migraines, seizures, or bad humors in the head. Some people believed trepanation could even boost intelligence or creativity by increasing blood flow to the brain. And here's the scary part. People actually did it. There are documented cases of home trepanations where patients survived and claimed they felt clearer or happier afterward. But there were also plenty of cases where things went horribly wrong. Infections, bleeding, brain damage, and of course, death. Even more bizarre is that trepanation has popped up again and again throughout history, including in the 20th century as part of strange fringe movements. In the 1960s and 70s, a small group of enthusiasts revived the practice, arguing that drilling a hole in your skull permanently could restore a childlike state of consciousness. One man named Bart Hudges famously drilled his own skull with an electric drill and wrote a manifesto about how great it felt afterward. Please do not try this at home. The persistence of trepanation shows just how powerful the idea was, that maybe the brain was trapped inside the skull and needed an escape route. For people with severe headaches or seizures, it probably felt like a desperate last resort, especially in times when there were few effective medical treatments available. By the mid-20th century, mainstream medicine completely abandoned trepanation, except in very specific surgical contexts, like relieving pressure after a head injury. But the fact that trepanation kits were once sold for home use is a chilling reminder that DIY medicine has always been around, and not always in the safest ways. So next time you get a headache and think, "I'd do anything to make this stop," be glad the solution today is as simple as popping an ibuprofen and not handing your friend a hand-crank drill and asking them to bore a hole in your skull. Bloodletting Sets. If you ever complained to a doctor in the Middle Ages about a headache, a fever, or pretty much anything, chances are their solution was simple. drain some of your blood. For nearly 2,000 years, bloodletting was the go-to treatment for almost every illness imaginable. And it wasn't just a medieval thing. Well into the 19th century, doctors carried bloodletting kits with them like we carry first aid kits today. The idea came from the ancient belief in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it was thought that these humors were out of balance. Too much blood? No problem. Just get rid of some. Bloodletting sets often included a variety of sharp tools: scalpels, lancets, and scarificators, devices with spring-loaded blades that could cut you multiple times at once. And of course, there were leeches, which became iconic for this practice. Doctors would open a vein in your arm or neck and let the blood flow into a bowl. In some cases, they'd remove a pint or more. If you were very sick, they might repeat the process several times over a few days. For children or delicate patients, they'd use leeches to do the job more gently. This wasn't just a last resort. It was done for everything. Headache, bloodletting. Fever, bloodletting. Pneumonia, bloodletting. Even mental illness was treated this way. George Washington, the first U.S. president, famously had nearly 5 pints of blood drained from him over the course of a single day while being treated for a throat infection. And many historians think it hastened his death. And yet, for centuries, people swore by it. Some patients actually reported feeling better right after a session, probably because they were lightheaded and too weak to notice their original symptoms. In a strange way, that made bloodletting seem like it worked, so doctors kept doing it. It wasn't until the 19th century, when medicine became more scientific, that bloodletting finally started to lose its grip. Studies showed it did little to help and often made patients worse by weakening them even further. By the early 20th century, the practice had mostly disappeared, except for a few specific medical uses, like treating hemochromatosis, a condition where the body has too much iron. Today, bloodletting sets are museum curiosities, gleaming brass and steel instruments that look more like torture devices than medical tools. But they're an important reminder of just how long humans clung to the idea that draining blood was the key to health. So the next time you have a fever and reach for a pain reliever, be grateful you don't have to lie down while a doctor cheerfully opens a vein and lets a pint of blood pour out into a bowl.
Radiation shoe fitters. Imagine being a kid in the 1940s or 50s and going shopping for new shoes. Instead of just trying them on and walking around the store, you'd stick your feet into a big wooden box and watch your actual bones glow on a little screen. It sounds like a scene out of a science fiction movie, but it was totally real. These machines were called fluoroscopes, and they were installed in shoe stores all over the United States, Europe, and Canada. The idea was genius for the time. X-ray technology had recently been discovered and was seen as futuristic and safe. So why not use it to make sure your shoes fit perfectly? Kids could see the bones of their feet wiggling inside the shoe in real time, while the salesman proudly explained how scientific their shoe-fitting process was. And honestly, it probably was kind of cool. The machine had 3 viewing windows, one for the customer, one for the parent, and one for the salesperson, so everyone could ooh and ah over the glowing skeleton. It felt like cutting-edge technology, and parents loved the idea that they were getting a perfect fit for their child's shoes. But here's the problem. Those machines were basically blasting kids' feet and everything nearby with massive doses of radiation. Back then, people didn't fully understand the risks of repeated radiation exposure. Some stores even encouraged kids to use the machine multiple times just to make sure, turning shoe shopping into a kind of fun activity. The danger wasn't just to the kids. Shoe salesmen who worked near these machines were exposed all day long. Over time, some developed radiation burns on their legs, skin cancer, and even bone problems from chronic exposure. There are documented cases of store employees losing toes or developing ulcers that wouldn't heal because of radiation damage. By the late 1950s, health experts started raising alarms. Studies showed that these machines leaked radiation and that the doses were much higher than anyone thought. Eventually, government agencies stepped in and banned them, or at least heavily regulated their use. By the 1970s, radiation shoe fitters had all but vanished from stores. Today, those machines are mostly found in museums, where they're displayed as relics of a time when we thought radiation was a fun, harmless novelty. It's wild to think that something we now associate with hospital imaging and caution signs was once part of a normal day at the mall. So, the next time you go shoe shopping and the salesperson just asks you to walk around in them a bit, remember, it could be worse. At least no one is nuking your feet with X-rays for fashion's sake.
Snake oil operations. You've probably heard the phrase snake oil salesman to describe a scammer selling worthless cures. But here's the thing. Snake oil was real, and in some cases, treatments with snakes literally involved the snakes themselves. The original idea of snake oil actually came from traditional Chinese medicine. Chinese laborers in the 1800s used oil from the Chinese water snake, which really does contain omega-3 fatty acids and has anti-inflammatory properties. Rubbing it on sore joints after a hard day's work actually helped. But when the concept came to the American West, things took a turn. Traveling medicine shows started selling snake oil that had no actual snake in it, just cheap mineral oil, turpentine, or alcohol. The term snake oil salesman was born to describe these con artists who made big promises but delivered nothing but watered-down booze. And then there were the even stranger cases, the so-called snake operations or live snake treatments. Some quack doctors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries believed that the act of being bitten by a snake could cure certain ailments. Others used live snakes in bizarre blood purification rituals, claiming the venom had detoxifying effects if applied in controlled amounts. In some rural areas, they were actual traveling healers who would put on shows, letting snakes bite them to prove their power, then sell tonics supposedly made from snake venom as cures for arthritis, impotence, or general fatigue. In some cases, they'd even offer snakebite therapy to customers right there on the spot.
Unsurprisingly, this sometimes ended badly, with infections, allergic reactions, or full-on venom poisoning. And even when the snakes weren't biting, the snake oil products themselves could be dangerous. Some were loaded with strong alcohol or narcotics to make the user feel a temporary buzz, tricking them into thinking the treatment worked. Others contained harmful chemicals that irritated the skin or stomach. By the early 1900s, government crackdowns on false medical advertising started putting these operations out of business. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a big turning point, requiring manufacturers to actually list what was in their products. Many snake oil remedies quietly disappeared after that, probably because revealing the ingredients would have ruined the sales pitch. But the legend of the snake oil salesman lives on today as a symbol of fake cures and shady promises. The truth is, the real Chinese snake oil might have actually worked. It was the American knockoffs and bizarre live snake stunts that gave the whole thing a bad name. So next time you hear someone call something snake oil, just remember, there was a time when that phrase might have meant an actual snake in a traveling wagon and someone ready to let it bite you in the name of medicine.
Mummy powder. Yes, this is exactly what it sounds like. For centuries, Europeans were obsessed with the idea that ground-up Egyptian mummies could cure their illnesses. If that sounds like a plot from a horror story, well, it kind of was, but it was also completely normal medicine from the Middle Ages all the way into the 17th and even 18th centuries. The logic went like this. Mummies were preserved with resins and bitumen, a tar-like substance, which was thought to have powerful healing properties. Doctors and apothecaries sold mumia, a brownish powder scraped from actual human remains, and claimed it could treat everything from headaches and stomach aches to broken bones. Wealthy Europeans would buy little jars of this stuff and mix it into wine, honey, or even just eat it straight. It was considered a luxury medicine, a sign that you could afford the very best, even if the best was literally a dead person ground into dust. And it wasn't just about healing. Some people believed mummy powder could transfer the vitality of the dead to the living. If you were weak or sickly, consuming a bit of a preserved ancient body was supposed to make you stronger. Sounds like something out of dark magic, right? But this was standard medical practice. Of course, there was a practical problem. There weren't nearly enough authentic Egyptian mummies to keep up with demand. So, clever merchants started faking them, digging up recently deceased bodies, drying them out, and selling them as genuine mummies. Some were even executed criminals, turned into medicine for paying customers. Did it work? Not really. At best, the bitumen might have had mild antiseptic properties. At worst, you were eating ground-up human remains full of bacteria and hoping for a miracle cure. And yet this practice went on for hundreds of years. Even famous historical figures like King Francis I of France reportedly kept a little pouch of mummy powder on him to consume whenever he felt unwell. Eventually, science began to catch up, and doctors started to realize this was more superstition than medicine. By the 18th and 19th centuries, mummy powder was falling out of fashion, though some people still used it for a while as a sort of exotic remedy. Today, the idea of eating mummies sounds horrifying. partly because we now respect ancient remains as priceless cultural artifacts, not ingredients. But back then, mummies were shipped to Europe by the crate, ground up in apothecaries, and sold like herbal supplements. So next time you hear about some weird wellness trend involving ancient secrets, just be glad it doesn't involve sprinkling 3,000-year-old corpse dust into your smoothie.
Beaver Castoreum Tonics. You know how every weird health trend these days seems to involve some superfood or rare natural extract? Well, centuries ago, one of those miracle cures came from beavers. Specifically, from a substance called castoreum, a secretion from the castor sacs near a beaver's tail, which are located right next to, well, its rear end. Castoreum has a strong musky smell, and it was prized for centuries because people believed it had powerful healing properties. Apothecaries would dry it, powder it, or mix it into tonics and sell it as a treatment for headaches, fevers, cramps, and even hysteria. If you had a pounding migraine in the 1600s, your doctor might have literally prescribed you a shot of beaver gland juice. And this wasn't just some folk remedy, it was respected medicine. Physicians from the Middle Ages through the 19th century wrote about castoreum in medical texts, praising its ability to calm nerves and ease pain. It was thought to act as a muscle relaxant and even to stimulate the uterus, so it was sometimes used for menstrual problems. People would drink castoreum in wine, swallow it in capsules, or rub it on their temples. There were even claims that it could prevent seizures and ward off the plague. Basically, if something was wrong with you, there was a castoreum tonic for it. The weirdest part? People swore it worked. Probably because castoreum actually does contain compounds like salicylic acid, a chemical relative of aspirin, and castorin, which can have a mild sedative effect. So it wasn't completely snake oil. But here's the thing. The process of collecting castoreum was not exactly pleasant. It meant trapping beavers and removing their castor sacs, which were then dried and shipped off to pharmacies. Beaver populations in some areas were heavily hunted, not just for their fur, but for this bizarre medical demand. Even as medicine advanced, castoreum stuck around. In the 19th century, it was still being sold as a remedy for nervous disorders and migraines. Eventually, though, it fell out of favor as modern painkillers like aspirin became widely available. People finally had a way to treat headaches that didn't involve, well, beaver anatomy. Believe it or not, castoreum is still used today, but mostly in the flavor and fragrance industry. It's sometimes used to add a vanilla-like note to perfumes, or even to flavor foods. Yes, it's FDA approved as a natural flavoring, though it's rare because it's expensive. So next time you have a headache and reach for ibuprofen, just be grateful you don't have to sip on beaver gland wine and hope for the best. The history of castoreum proves that when people were desperate for relief, they'd try almost anything, even if it came from the backside of a very surprised beaver.
Human skull moss. If you thought mummy powder was creepy, wait until you hear about skull moss. Yes, people once believed that moss growing on human skulls had powerful healing properties. So much so that they scraped it off graves and turned it into medicine. Known as usnea, or sometimes moss of the skull. This strange remedy was popular in Europe from the Middle Ages through the 18th century. Apothecaries would literally go to graveyards, find old skulls in crypts or charnel houses, and collect the fuzzy green moss that grew on them. Then they'd dry it, powder it, and sell it in little jars. The uses for skull moss were surprisingly broad. It was thought to stop nosebleeds, heal wounds, and, most famously, treat epilepsy. People believed that because the moss grew on human remains, it carried some kind of life essence or special connection to the human body. So, if you consumed it, that life energy would transfer to you and calm whatever was wrong. One of the most common treatments was to mix powdered skull moss with wine and drink it to prevent seizures. Some doctors recommended snorting the powder directly into the nose to stop bleeding, which sounds absolutely horrifying, but was taken very seriously at the time. Others would apply it to cuts and bruises, hoping it would draw out the bad humors and speed healing. And here's the eerie part. This wasn't considered dark magic or fringe superstition. It was sold right alongside other official medicines in apothecaries. Well-to-do families might even keep a little vial of skull moss at home for emergencies. Did it actually work? Probably not the way people thought. Nosebleeds might have stopped simply because the powder helped clot the blood mechanically, not because of any mystical property. And epilepsy, of course, was not cured by graveyard plants. But the placebo effect can be powerful, and some patients may have believed it helped. Still, the idea of people wandering through cemeteries scraping moss off skulls is undeniably macabre. There were even reports of grave robbing specifically to get skulls with good moths. The rarer the moth, the more expensive it was. Some claimed moss from the skull of a young person was the most potent, while others swore that moss from an executed criminal's skull was the strongest cure. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as medicine became more scientific, skull moss fell out of fashion, but not before leaving behind centuries of truly creepy treatments. Today, it's mostly remembered as one of the more Gothic examples of pre-modern medicine, a reminder of how thin the line was between healing and superstition. So, next time you get a nosebleed and grab a tissue, just be glad you don't have to head down to the nearest graveyard with a pocket knife, hoping to find a mossy skull to scrape.
Snake venom injections. It sounds like the plot of a superhero origin story. Inject yourself with snake venom and hope it makes you stronger. But in the early and mid-20th century, snake venom injections were actually marketed as cutting-edge medicine, specifically as painkillers and treatments for chronic illnesses. The idea wasn't completely insane. Scientists noticed that some snake venoms have complex effects on the nervous system and blood clotting. Certain components can act as muscle relaxants, and others block nerve signals, which led doctors to wonder, could this be used to relieve pain? So, researchers began experimenting with purified snake venom in tiny doses. Clinics popped up offering venom injections for arthritis, neuralgia, nerve pain, and even multiple sclerosis. The promise was tempting: a natural, powerful painkiller that worked where ordinary medicine had failed. And some patients swore it worked. There are stories of people with debilitating arthritis who claimed they could walk again after a course of venom injections.
Others said their chronic pain melted away for weeks at a time. The treatment became popular enough that you could find snake venom therapy being advertised in medical journals, wellness centers, and even some mainstream clinics. But here's the catch. Snake venom is still snake venom. Even in small doses, it can cause intense reactions, swelling, nausea, convulsions, and in rare cases, death. The problem was that the potency of venom could vary depending on the species, the batch, and the preparation method. Some patients had severe allergic reactions, anaphylaxis, which could be life-threatening. And because this was happening before modern drug regulation got really strict, quality control was all over the place. Some injections may have been too strong, others too weak, and some snake venom treatments probably didn't even contain real venom at all, just saline and a good sales pitch. By the late 20th century, as better pain medications were developed and the risks became clearer, snake venom therapy largely faded from mainstream medicine, but it never completely disappeared. Even today, there are alternative health clinics that still offer venom-based treatments claiming benefits for pain, immune disorders, and even cancer, though there's little scientific evidence to back most of those claims. Ironically, modern science has actually found real medical uses for some snake venom components, but in carefully controlled, lab-made forms. There are FDA-approved drugs for high blood pressure and clotting disorders derived from snake venom proteins. So the idea wasn't totally wrong, it was just way too risky in its early, unregulated form. So next time you reach for a bottle of ibuprofen, imagine the alternative. Rolling up your sleeve and letting someone inject you with a drop of cobra venom while promising it'll make your back pain go away. It might have, but it also might have sent you straight to the ER.
Dried viper soup. You've probably heard of chicken soup being called a cure for everything, but in centuries past, some people swore by something much more intense: viper soup. Yes, as in actual venomous snakes boiled into a broth and served as medicine. For hundreds of years, particularly in parts of Europe and Asia, dried viper was considered a powerful health food. Apothecaries would dry and powder the meat and bones of vipers, often after carefully removing the fangs and venom glands, and sell it as an ingredient for soups and tonics. It was marketed as a way to renew the blood, cure skin problems, and restore youth and vitality. The idea was that vipers had some kind of natural strength and regenerative power. After all, they shed their skin and renew themselves, and by eating them, you could absorb that strength. Recipes for viper broth appear in old medical texts, often alongside claims that it could cure leprosy, gout, and even plague symptoms. Some preparations were downright elaborate. In 17th century France, there was a dish known as broth of vipers that was considered a delicacy among the wealthy. It wasn't just about health, it was about status. If you were rich enough to get your hands on imported vipers, you could serve a restorative soup to your guests and show off both your wealth and your commitment to longevity. But this wasn't just a fad for the rich. In some rural areas, viper meat was sold dried in local markets as a general tonic for fatigue and weakness. People believed it could give them energy and strengthen their immune systems. Of course, there were risks. If the snake wasn't prepared properly, trace venom could still be present, causing nausea, vomiting, or worse.
And since sanitation standards weren't exactly modern, there was always the danger of foodborne illness. Plus, the science behind it was mostly superstition. There is no evidence that eating dried viper actually rejuvenates the body. Still, this practice hung on for a surprisingly long time. In fact, viper-based products were still sold in Europe into the early 20th century, with some health spas advertising viper extracts as beauty treatments or anti-aging supplements. Today, viper soup is still eaten in a few parts of the world, particularly in southern China, but it's now more of a culinary curiosity than a mainstream health remedy. And thankfully, you don't have to worry about someone handing you a steaming bowl of snake broth when you say you're feeling run down. It's a reminder that, for much of history, the line between food and medicine was blurry, and sometimes the solution for a bad day was literally eat a snake and feel better.
Ground-up pearl medicine. If you think luxury wellness trends today, like gold face masks or crystal-infused water, are a little over the top, just wait until you hear about the centuries-long tradition of swallowing ground-up pearls as medicine. Yes, real pearls, crushed into powder, mixed into drinks or pills, and taken as a cure for everything from anxiety to indigestion. This practice goes back thousands of years, especially in China, India, and the Middle East. In traditional Chinese medicine, pearl powder was prized as a remedy to nourish the yin, calm the spirit, and make the skin beautiful. It was considered a treatment for insomnia, nervousness, and even heart palpitations. Some texts even claimed it could lengthen life and keep you youthful, which made it especially popular among wealthy elites and royalty. And pearls weren't just used in Asia. During the Renaissance in Europe, ground-up pearls were mixed into wine or milk and prescribed as a treatment for stress, fainting spells, and melancholy, basically what we'd call anxiety or depression today. Wealthy women would take it to keep their complexions pale and radiant, and some doctors swore it was the ultimate cure for hysteria. Of course, this was not a cheap remedy. Pearls were rare and expensive, so pearl medicine was a luxury only the rich could afford. Taking it was a way to show off, a little like drinking gold-flecked champagne today. The idea of literally consuming jewels to improve your health made you look both glamorous and sophisticated. But did it actually work? Surprisingly, there might have been some benefit, at least for the skin. Pearls are made of calcium carbonate, which can have a soothing effect on the stomach and is still used in modern antacids. Pearl powder also contains trace minerals and amino acids, which may have helped with skin health in the long term. But it certainly wasn't the miracle cure it was advertised to be, and you'd have to consume a lot of pearls to get a meaningful dose of anything. Still, people swore by it. There are historical records of queens, emperors, and sultans taking pearl medicine daily, believing it kept them calm, elegant, and youthful. Some even had special pearl pharmacies where the gems were ground fresh for them each morning. Today, pearl powder hasn't completely disappeared. You can still find it in some luxury supplements and beauty products, marketed as a collagen booster or skin brightener. But thankfully, it's no longer prescribed as an all-purpose cure for nervous disorders. So next time you feel stressed and reach for some herbal tea or a magnesium supplement, just be glad you don't have to crush up your grandmother's pearl necklace to get a little relief.
History proves that when it comes to wellness, humans have always been willing to pay a small fortune, or in this case, eat actual treasure, just to feel a little calmer. Goat testicle implants. If you think today's ads for testosterone boosters are aggressive, wait until you hear about the guy who became famous for implanting goat testicles into men to restore their virility. Yes, this really happened, and people lined up for it. The man behind this bizarre chapter in medical history was Dr. John R. Brinkley, or at least that's what he called himself. Brinkley was a charming, smooth-talking doctor, though his medical credentials were sketchy at best, who set up a clinic in Kansas in the 1920s. His claim to fame? He could cure impotence, boost energy, and restore masculinity by surgically implanting slivers of goat testicle tissue into a man's scrotum. Brinkley advertised heavily, promising that his rejuvenation procedure would give men the stamina of a goat. And believe it or not, men came from all over the country, some even from overseas, to have this operation done. He charged hundreds of dollars per procedure, a fortune at the time, and soon he was making millions. Did it work? Of course not. The implanted goat tissue would be rejected by the body within weeks. Some patients developed infections, gangrene, or other complications. But Brinkley was a master showman. He published glowing testimonials, staged radio broadcasts, and even claimed his patients were fathering children at record rates thanks to his miracle procedure. And it wasn't just men. Brinkley offered similar treatments for women, claiming he could restore youth and sexual vitality with goat gland transplants. His clinic became a sensation, and for a while he was one of the most famous and richest doctors in America. But eventually his empire started to crumble. The American Medical Association launched investigations into his work, and reporters began digging into his credentials. It turned out he didn't have a real medical degree, and many of his patients had suffered serious harm. Some even died. Brinkley's medical license was revoked in the 1930s, but he wasn't done yet. He built one of the most powerful radio stations in the world on the Mexican border, and used it to advertise his treatments directly to millions of listeners. Even after losing his license, he kept performing surgeries in secret for years, until lawsuits and fraud charges finally caught up with him. By the time Brinkley died in 1942, he was broke and disgraced, but he left behind a bizarre legacy as the man who made goat testicle implants famous. Looking back, it's shocking how many people were willing to risk their health and their money for a promise of restored virility. But it's also a reminder that miracle cures for aging and masculinity have always been big business. Goat glands, herbal pills, testosterone shots, you name it. The packaging changes, but the sales pitch stays the same. Kickapoo Indian Sagwa. In the late 1800s, America was obsessed with the idea of natural medicine, and what could sound more natural than an ancient Native American secret remedy? Enter Kickapoo Indian Sagwa, one of the most famous patent medicines of its day. Kickapoo Indian Sagwa was sold as a blood purifier, a cure for constipation, headaches, rheumatism, bad blood, and just about any other ailment you could think of. Advertisements promised that it was based on traditional Native American herbal wisdom passed down for generations. The labels featured images of native people in headdresses, and the marketing leaned hard on the idea that this was an authentic tribal remedy. Here's the thing: it wasn't. The product was created by two white businessmen, Charles Bigelow and John Healy, who came up with the idea of using Native American imagery to sell their medicine. They even hired actual Kickapoo tribe members to travel with their medicine shows, performing dances and ceremonies to attract crowds. It was a brilliant piece of marketing, and it worked. But what was actually in Kickapoo Indian Sagwa? Mostly herbs, water, and a generous amount of alcohol. Like many patent medicines of the time, it was loaded with booze, often around 20% or more. That meant people who drank it felt better almost instantly, not because it was purifying their blood, but because they were basically having a strong cocktail. This made it particularly popular with people who didn't or couldn't drink openly, including women in dry households and even children. If you had a headache or stomach upset, a dose of sagwa would relax you, ease the pain, and maybe even put you in a good mood, thanks to the alcohol content. The medicine shows were a huge part of its success. The Kickapoo Indian Medicine Company would travel from town to town with performers, music, and speeches about the power of natural healing. They'd sell bottles of sagwa right on the spot, and people would buy them by the case. Of course, as the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 came into effect, products like sagwa had to start listing their ingredients. Once people realized they were mostly buying expensive booze, the popularity began to decline. By the 1910s and 20s, Kickapoo Indian Sagwa was fading from the market, although the brand name survived for decades in smaller forms. Today, it's remembered as one of the most famous examples of snake oil marketing, a product that sold not just a medicine, but an entire image of exotic healing. It's also a reminder of how often companies used and exploited Native American imagery to sell products that had nothing to do with indigenous traditions. So next time you see an all-natural health product with a mysterious backstory, remember, we've been falling for that kind of marketing for over a century, even when it was just a bottle of strong herbal booze dressed up as ancient wisdom.
Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root. If you lived in the late 1800s or early 1900s and had any kind of stomach trouble, backache, or even just felt run down, chances were you would have heard of Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root kidney, liver, and bladder cure. It was one of the most famous patent medicines of its time, sold in fancy bottles, advertised in newspapers across the country,
and promising to fix just about everything wrong with you. Swamp root was marketed as a miracle tonic that could cleanse your system, restore energy, and regulate the kidneys. The ads were everywhere, in magazines, on posters, even on almanacs that were given away for free just to get people to read about the product. One ad even claimed, "It has no equal." But here's the thing. The exact formula was a closely guarded secret. For decades, no one really knew what was in swamp root besides alcohol, because of course it had alcohol. Most tonics did back then. What we do know is that it contained a mix of herbs with strong laxative and diuretic effects. So yes, it probably did make you feel like something was happening, because you'd be running to the bathroom not long after taking it. That was kind of the point. In the 19th century, people were obsessed with the idea of cleansing the system. If you felt tired or sick, it was assumed your body was full of impurities that needed to be flushed out. Swamp root promised to do exactly that. Clear your kidneys, liver, and bladder, leaving you refreshed and healthy. And people loved it. Testimonials pour in from happy customers, claiming swamp root cured their back pain, headaches, indigestion, and more. It was so popular that the Kilmer Company became a massive success, with swamp root sold all over the United States and beyond. But not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pointed out that most of the cures were probably just the result of, well, being cleaned out by a very strong laxative. And as medical regulations got stricter in the early 20th century, companies had to be more honest about what their products actually did. Swamp root quietly dropped the word cure from its name and rebranded as a more generic kidney remedy to avoid legal trouble. By the mid-20th century, swamp root's popularity started to decline as better, more targeted medicines became available. But for decades, it was a household name, a little bottle of mysterious liquid that promised to fix just about everything, even if its main trick was just making sure your plumbing was in perfect working order. It's a perfect example of how early medicine didn't just treat symptoms. It made people feel like they were being treated, even if the science behind it was shaky. And sometimes that feeling was all people really wanted.
Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. In the late 1800s, women didn't have a lot of control over their medical care, or their lives in general. Doctors were mostly men, and women's troubles, like painful periods, menopause, or postpartum depression, were often dismissed or treated as hysteria. Enter Lydia Pinkham, a savvy businesswoman who turned her own home remedy into one of the most famous tonics in American history. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was marketed as a cure for female complaints, which covered just about everything from menstrual cramps to hot flashes to mood swings. The ads promised relief, improved energy,
and restored femininity. And they were everywhere. The marketing was brilliant. Lydia's face appeared on every bottle, making women feel like they could trust her. And, to be fair, this was revolutionary in its own way. Lydia's advertising spoke directly to women at a time when that was almost unheard of. She encouraged women to write her letters describing their symptoms, and the company would write back with advice, sometimes even offering free consultations. For many women, this felt like a lifeline in a world where no one took their pain seriously. But here's the kicker. The compound contained a lot of alcohol. Some versions were over 15–20% alcohol, about the strength of wine or sherry. For many women, especially those living in dry households or in the era of Prohibition, this was one of the only socially acceptable ways to drink. It's not hard to imagine that some of the relief they felt was less about curing cramps and more about taking the edge off with a stiff drink. That doesn't mean it was completely useless. The mixture also contained herbs like black cohosh and unicorn root, which can have mild effects on menstrual cramps and hormonal symptoms. But the real star was clearly the alcohol, which helped relax the body and mind, and probably made the whole experience of being a woman in the 1800s just a little more bearable. Critics later accused Lydia Pinkham's company of selling false hope in a bottle, but others argue it was empowering. After all, women were finally able to take charge of their own health in a time when their choices were limited. Even as medicine advanced, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound stayed on the market for decades, and the company still exists today, though the alcohol content has been drastically reduced. It remains one of the longest-running women's health brands in history. Looking back, this is one of those stories that's both funny and kind of inspiring. Yes, it was basically a boozy herbal tonic, but it also gave women a sense of agency at a time when that was rare. And if a little alcohol helped them feel better about life's struggles, well, maybe Lydia was onto something after all.
Carter's Little Liver Pills. If you lived in the late 1800s or early 1900s, there's a good chance you had a bottle of Carter's Little Liver Pills in your medicine cabinet. They were one of the most popular patent medicines of their time. Tiny tablets that promised to fix just about every problem you could think of: headaches, fatigue, bad complexion, irritability, and of course, liver problems. The ads were everywhere with catchy slogans like, "Don't be cross, be cheerful," and "They act directly on the liver." The idea was simple. If you weren't feeling well, your liver must be sluggish or congested. The cure? Take a Carter's pill to wake up the liver and get your system running smoothly again. But here's the truth. These pills really didn't do much for your liver. They were basically strong laxatives. The main ingredient was bisacodyl, or earlier versions used other purgative compounds, which stimulates the bowels and makes you, well, need to go. And once you did, you probably felt lighter, less bloated, and maybe even a little happier, which made people believe the pills had worked. In a way, they did exactly what they were supposed to, just not in the way the marketing suggested. People came to associate that cleaned-out feeling with better health, so Carter's pills became a trusted household remedy. Families kept them around for everything, from upset stomachs to cranky moods. The company's marketing was relentless. They produced almanacs, calendars, and pamphlets with health tips that always circled back to the same solution: take a Carter's Little Liver Pill. They even leaned into vanity advertising, suggesting that a sluggish liver caused pimples and a muddy complexion. So if you wanted to look radiant, you'd better take your pills. Eventually, regulators caught on. In 1943, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission forced Carter's to change its advertising because the pills had nothing to do with the liver. The company rebranded them as Carter's Little Pills and toned down the health claims. But by then, newer over-the-counter laxatives were flooding the market, and their popularity gradually declined. Still, for decades, Carter's Little Liver Pills were a cultural staple, a tiny tablet with a big promise. They're a perfect example of how early medicine often confused making you feel something with actually curing you. If a pill made you run to the bathroom and left you feeling a little better afterward, that was proof enough that it must have been working. So next time you hear someone talking about detoxing or flushing out toxins, just remember, we've been sold on the idea of cleansing the system for over a century. And back then, the solution wasn't a green smoothie. It was a tiny pill that kept you very, very regular.
Snake oil liniments. We all know the phrase snake oil salesman as a way to describe a scammer, but few people realize just how literal it was and how popular these products once were. Snake oil liniments were everywhere in the 1800s, sold as miracle cures for joint pain, back pain, sore muscles, headaches, toothaches, you name it. If something hurt, there was a snake oil for it. But here's the twist. Most of them didn't contain any snake oil at all. The original inspiration for these products came from Chinese immigrants working on the American railroads. They brought with them real snake oil made from Chinese water snakes, which is actually rich in omega-3 fatty acids and does have anti-inflammatory properties. They used it to treat sore joints after long hours of labor, and it reportedly worked well. Entrepreneurs saw how popular it was and thought, hey, we can sell this to everyone. The problem was that Chinese water snakes weren't exactly abundant in the American West. So instead of importing the real thing, many companies just made their own versions, usually a mix of mineral oil, camphor, and sometimes turpentine. Yes, the same stuff you use as paint thinner. Some versions even contained ingredients like red pepper extract to make your skin feel warm and tingly, so it seemed like the medicine was working. And to be fair, some of these liniments probably did provide temporary relief, just by irritating the skin and increasing blood flow, but they had nothing to do with snakes. Salesmen would travel town to town, putting on shows where they claimed the liniment could cure everything from arthritis to baldness to the common cold. They give dramatic demonstrations, rubbing it on volunteers and promising instant results. Then they'd sell as many bottles as they could before skipping town, often before anyone realized it didn't actually do much. The reputation of snake oil took a huge hit after a famous case in 1917 when the U.S. government tested a popular brand called Clark Stanley's Snake Oil Liniment and found it contained absolutely no snake oil, just mineral oil, chili powder, and turpentine. The company was fined for false advertising, and the phrase snake oil salesman became forever linked with fraud. Today, snake oil liniments are mostly a joke.
But the story is a perfect reminder of how powerful marketing can be. People were desperate for relief from pain, and they trusted anyone who promised an easy cure, even if that cure was just spicy paint thinner in a bottle. So next time someone tries to sell you a miracle product online, think about those traveling medicine shows. If it sounds too good to be true, there's a good chance it's the 21st century version of snake oil, just with fancier packaging and a better Instagram ad.
Warner's Safe Cure. In the late 1800s, kidney problems were scary and mysterious. People knew that if your kidneys failed, you could get very sick, but they didn't fully understand why. Enter Warner's Safe Cure, one of the most famous kidney tonics of its time, sold as the solution to everything from back pain to Bright's disease, what we'd now call chronic kidney disease. Warner's Safe Cure was invented by H. Warner, a businessman from Rochester, New York, who claimed the formula had saved him from kidney trouble. He wasn't a doctor, but he was a marketing genius. He put the word safe right in the name to make customers feel confident, and it worked. By the 1880s, Warner's Safe Cure was being sold all over the United States, Europe, and even as far away as Australia. The bottle itself was iconic, an amber glass flask stamped with the words Warner's Safe Cure that collectors still hunt for today. Ads promised that this tonic could cure kidney disease, liver disease, diabetes, bladder problems, female troubles, and all disorders of the urinary organs. Basically, if anything in your lower back hurt, Warner's claimed to fix it. But what was actually in it? Like many patent medicines of the era, it contained a blend of herbs and a lot of alcohol. The exact recipe was a secret, but analysis of surviving bottles suggests it included juniper, a diuretic, aloe, and other plant extracts. The alcohol content made people feel warm and relaxed, which they took as a sign that it was working. The juniper probably did make them urinate more, which might have temporarily relieved some symptoms, but it wasn't exactly a cure for kidney disease. And while the name Safe Cure implied total safety, that wasn't necessarily true. Overusing strong diuretics can dehydrate you and put even more strain on your kidneys. There's no evidence Warner's product actually reversed serious kidney problems, but there's plenty of evidence that people kept buying it anyway, hoping for relief. Warner's marketing machine was relentless. The company distributed free almanacs with health advice that always conveniently recommended Warner's products. There were spin-offs like Warner's Safe Pills and Warner's Safe Nervine, each claiming to treat a different set of problems. By the early 20th century, government regulation began to catch up with the patent medicine industry. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required more honest labeling, and Warner's eventually had to tone down its claims. The product lingered on the market for a while, but gradually faded as modern medicine offered more effective treatments. Today, Warner's Safe Cure is remembered as one of the most successful and most overhyped tonics of the patent medicine era.
The bottles are now collector's items, but the idea that you could fix your kidneys with a daily swig of mystery herbs and booze is more historical curiosity than medical advice. Puruna. If you had the sniffles in the early 1900s, chances are someone would tell you to take a swig of Puruna. It was one of the most famous patent medicines in American history. A cure for colds, catarrh, that catch-all term for mucus problems back then, and just about anything else that made you feel under the weather. Puruna was invented by Dr. S.B. Hartman, who claimed it could treat and prevent colds, coughs, and even serious diseases. The ads were everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, often featuring testimonials from grateful customers who said Puruna saved their lives. There were even pictures of babies and entire families smiling with a bottle of Puruna on the kitchen table. So what made Puruna so effective? Well, it wasn't magic. It was alcohol. A lot of alcohol. Analyses from the time showed Puruna was about 25 to 28% alcohol, making it roughly as strong as sherry or port wine. So when you took a spoonful for your cough, you were basically taking a shot. No wonder people said they felt better. This was particularly appealing during the Prohibition era, 1920 to 1933, when alcohol was illegal in most places. Puruna became one of the most popular medicines in America because it gave you a perfectly legal buzz. It wasn't just a cold remedy, it was an excuse to drink. People swore by it. Some claimed it gave them energy, lifted their spirits, and kept them healthy through winter. But of course, it didn't actually cure colds or prevent disease. It just made you feel good enough to forget you were sick. And if you were taking it every few hours, as directed, you were basically day drinking your way through your illness. Puruna's popularity was so great that politicians and public figures openly endorsed it. There are even accounts of members of Congress praising it in speeches. But as medicine became more scientific, critics started calling Puruna out for what it really was, a glorified bottle of liquor marketed as medicine. In the early 20th century, as the Pure Food and Drug Act started forcing companies to disclose their ingredients, Puruna's reputation took a hit. Once people learned just how alcoholic it was, the brand slowly lost its medical credibility. It stuck around as a tonic, but its days as a miracle cure were over. Looking back, Puruna is a perfect example of how patent medicines often blurred the line between treatment and self-medication. People wanted to feel better, and Puruna delivered, just not in the way they thought. So next time you see a wellness tonic claiming to boost your immunity, just remember, 100 years ago, your grandma's favorite immune booster might have been a glass of what was basically fortified wine with a fancy medical label.
Hadacol. If there was one miracle tonic that summed up the wild world of mid-20th century medicine, it was Hadacol. This little brown bottle of B vitamin syrup exploded in popularity in the 1940s and 50s, promising to cure everything from fatigue to arthritis to digestive problems.
It was sold as a health drink, a pick-me-up, and even a way to balance your system. But here's the twist. Hadacol's biggest ingredient wasn't the vitamins. It was alcohol, about 12% by volume, roughly the strength of wine. That meant every dose of Hadacol was basically a shot of fortified booze with a dash of vitamins mixed in. Hadacol was created by Dudley J. LeBlanc, a Louisiana state senator and businessman who was a marketing genius. He claimed Hadacol could help people who were nutritionally deficient, which was technically true since it contained B vitamins, iron, and a few other nutrients. But what really made people feel better wasn't the nutrition. It was that warm, buzzy feeling you'd get after a couple tablespoons. And LeBlanc knew how to sell it. He launched a traveling road show, the Hadacol Caravan, featuring big-name performers like Bob Hope, Mickey Rooney, and Carmen Miranda. People would flock to these events, buy bottles of Hadacol, and leave convinced they'd just invested in their health. It became a cultural phenomenon, with ads plastered across newspapers, radio spots playing daily, and testimonials from happy customers claiming Hadacol gave them their lives back. The popularity was partly thanks to the fact that this was still the tail end of prohibition culture in some parts of the U.S., and many rural areas were dry. Hadacol gave people a legal excuse to drink, and because it was sold as medicine, it wasn't taxed like alcohol. People who needed Hadacol for their health were suddenly looking forward to their daily dose a little too much. But behind the scenes, critics were raising eyebrows. Doctors pointed out that while it might help if you were truly vitamin deficient, most people taking it didn't need it, and the alcohol content was concerning, especially since it was marketed to everyone, including the elderly and even children. Eventually, as federal regulators cracked down on false medical claims and better vitamin supplements became available, Hadacol's popularity began to fizzle. The company collapsed in the early 1950s under financial pressure, and LeBlanc was left with warehouses full of unsold product. Still, Hadacol is remembered fondly by many as a weird, uniquely American phenomenon, part medicine, part marketing stunt, part legal loophole for drinking. So next time you see a flashy wellness drink with celebrity endorsements, just remember, we've been chasing health in a bottle for a long time. And sometimes that bottle is just really expensive booze with a vitamin label slapped on it.
Tapeworm diet pills. If you think fad diets today are extreme, wait until you hear about this one. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some people desperate to lose weight actually swallowed tapeworms on purpose. Yes, real parasites, all in the name of getting thin. The idea behind tapeworm diet pills was both horrifying and weirdly logical. The pill would supposedly contain a tapeworm cyst or egg. Once it reached your intestines, the tapeworm would hatch, grow inside you, and start eating part of your food before your body could absorb it. In theory, you could eat whatever you wanted and still lose weight because the worm was sharing your calories.
And incredibly, some people actually did this. Advertisements for sanitized tapeworms appeared in newspapers, promising effortless weight loss with slogans like "Eat, eat, eat, and always stay thin." There were even elegant little pill boxes with dainty instructions, making it look almost glamorous. At first glance, it might have seemed like the perfect solution for women pressured to stay slim. No dieting, no exercise, just swallow a capsule and let biology do the rest. But the reality was horrifying. Tapeworm infections can cause severe stomach pain, diarrhea, malnutrition, anemia, and in some cases, the worms can migrate to other parts of the body, including the brain, causing seizures or even death. And here's the kicker. There's actually debate about whether those early tapeworm pills always contained real worms. Some historians think many of them were just scams, empty capsules sold to desperate people who believed they were infected. But we know for sure that some wealthy women actually sought out real tapeworms from shady doctors and specialists who would deliberately infect them. Once the worm did its job, or caused too many problems, the solution was to take a strong dose of antiparasitic medicine or even undergo surgery to remove it. Imagine going to your doctor because you've been feeling weak and dizzy, only to find out the cause is a 6-foot-long worm living in your gut, one you paid good money to have put there. By the mid-20th century, as science advanced and public health campaigns educated people about parasites, the tapeworm diet fell out of favor. Doctors began warning that the risks far outweighed any weight loss benefits, and the idea was mostly abandoned, though it still pops up every few years in internet shock articles or extreme weight loss discussions. Today, it's remembered as one of the most bizarre and dangerous diet trends in history. The kind of thing that proves just how far humans are willing to go to lose a few pounds. So, next time you see a miracle fat-burning pill online, remember, at least it doesn't come with a free parasite that moves in and stays rent-free in your intestines.
Phenol skin peels. If you think modern skincare can be harsh, just wait until you hear about the early days of chemical peels, when people were literally burning off layers of their skin with a toxic chemical called phenol in the name of beauty. Phenol, also known as carbolic acid, is a powerful disinfectant and industrial chemical. In the early 20th century, doctors noticed that applying phenol to the skin caused it to blister and peel, revealing fresh, pink skin underneath. Pretty soon, it became a popular cosmetic procedure for women who wanted to erase wrinkles, age spots, and acne scars. The idea was simple. Apply phenol to the face, wait for it to burn off the top layer of skin, and let the body heal with new, younger-looking skin. It was like hitting the reset button on your face, if you were brave enough to endure it. And make no mistake, this was not a spa day facial. Phenol peels were painful. Patients often had to be sedated or put under anesthesia while the chemical was applied. The recovery process could take weeks, during which your face would be swollen, raw, and scabbing. People sometimes had to hide indoors for a month while they healed. But the results could be dramatic.
Early Hollywood stars reportedly underwent phenol peels to keep their skin looking flawless on camera. The procedure became a symbol of ultimate dedication to beauty. If you were willing to suffer through it, you could turn back the clock. The problem? Phenol is highly toxic. If too much was absorbed through the skin, it could damage the heart, liver, and kidneys. There are reports of patients experiencing irregular heart rhythms or even dying from cardiac complications after a full-face phenol peel. Doctors eventually learned they had to carefully monitor patients' heart function during the procedure. And even when it worked, phenol peels often left behind side effects like permanent skin lightening, because phenol can destroy pigment cells, scarring, or an unnatural waxy look. It wasn't exactly the fresh-faced glow most people imagined. Despite all that, phenol pills are still around today, though they're far more controlled and carefully monitored than they were a century ago. They're considered one of the strongest types of chemical peels, used only for severe wrinkles or sun damage, and they require trained professionals and proper medical equipment. Looking back, it's hard not to shudder at the thought of willingly letting someone paint your face with a caustic chemical just to look younger. And yet, people lined up for it. So, next time you complain that your exfoliating serum stings a little, just be glad it isn't literally burning through your skin's surface while you sit in the doctor's chair, smelling carbolic acid and praying you don't faint.
Arsenic Complexion Soap. Imagine walking into a department store in the early 1900s and seeing a bar of soap proudly advertised as containing arsenic, not as a warning, as a selling point. This was the world of Arsenic Complexion Soap, a product that promised to give women a pale, flawless complexion by literally bathing their skin in poison. At the time, pale skin was considered the height of beauty. A fair, smooth face meant you were refined, upper class, and didn't have to work outside. So when soap makers discovered that arsenic could strip away blemishes and lighten skin tone, they turned it into a marketing goldmine. Ads for arsenic soap were everywhere. They promised to purify the skin, remove freckles, and give women a delicate, youthful bloom. Some even went so far as to say the soap could prevent aging and make the skin permanently fairer. In an era obsessed with porcelain-like complexions, this was a dream come true. Or so it seemed. Here's the scary part. Arsenic is incredibly toxic. It can be absorbed through the skin, and chronic exposure leads to all kinds of health problems. Nausea, hair loss, liver damage, skin lesions, and eventually cancer. Some women who used arsenic soap regularly reported dizziness, fainting spells, and strange dark patches developing on their skin. Ironically, the exact opposite of what they wanted. But because the effects developed slowly, people kept using it, thinking the soap was working. The immediate result, a smoother, paler face, probably encouraged them to ignore the longer-term consequences. And in an age with few regulations, companies weren't exactly lining up to put warning labels on their products. There were even rumors that some soaps contained enough arsenic to be dangerous if accidentally ingested.
meaning that if a child or pet got hold of it, the results could be fatal. By the mid-20th century, as scientists better understood arsenic poisoning, products like these started disappearing from shelves. Laws requiring safety testing and ingredient disclosure made it harder to sell something that was slowly poisoning its customers. But not before decades of people literally scrubbed their faces with toxic chemicals in the name of beauty. It's a creepy reminder of how far people have always been willing to go to meet beauty standards, and how many risks they were willing to take. Today, we still have skin lightening creams that are controversial because some of them contain mercury or other harmful substances, but at least we know to check the labels. So next time you're frustrated about a pimple or dark spot, be glad you can grab a gentle cleanser from the drugstore instead of lathering up with arsenic soap and hoping you don't accidentally poison yourself in the process.
Lysol vaginal douches. This one might be the most wince-inducing of them all. Believe it or not, there was a time when Lysol, yes, the same brand you use to disinfect your kitchen counters, was marketed as a vaginal douche. And it wasn't just a fringe thing. This was mainstream advice given to women for decades. In the early to mid-20th century, women were under enormous pressure to be fresh, clean, and desirable for their husbands. Advertisers preyed on those fears with products marketed as feminine hygiene solutions. Lysol was one of the most popular, and it was openly advertised in magazines as the key to a happy marriage. The implication was clear. If your husband seemed distant, it was probably your fault, and Lysol could fix it. The product came with instructions for use as a douche, essentially a vaginal rinse. The marketing promised that it would safeguard daintiness, banish odors, and keep women charming. Some ads even used thinly veiled language suggesting it could be used as a form of birth control, though this was never medically proven. But here's the terrifying part. The active ingredient in Lysol back then was cresol, a powerful disinfectant and phenol compound that can burn skin and mucous membranes. Women who followed the instructions sometimes ended up with severe chemical burns, ulcerations, and infections. In some cases, the damage was so bad it caused scarring and infertility. Even worse, many women suffered in silence because they were too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened. Some doctors at the time even endorsed Lysol douching, so women assumed the pain or irritation they felt was just proof it was working. And this wasn't a short-lived fad. Lysol ran these ads for decades, well into the 1950s and 60s. The messaging played heavily on guilt and fear with lines like, "Don't risk your marriage by being careless about feminine hygiene." It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation and a horrifying example of how little science went into women's health products at the time. By the 1970s, as women's health advocacy grew and better sexual education became available, the practice of using harsh disinfectants for douching was widely condemned. Medical experts began warning the douching of any kind can actually disrupt the natural balance of bacteria in the vagina and increase the risk of infection, not decrease it. Lysol quietly stopped promoting their product for this use, pivoting fully into the household cleaning market. Today, it's hard to imagine using something as harsh as Lysol for personal care. But this was once a routine part of many women's lives, sold to them as a sign of being a good wife. So next time you see an ad that tries to make you feel bad about your body just to sell you a product, remember, we've come a long way from the days when women were literally burning themselves with disinfectant to meet impossible standards.
Cigarettes for weight loss. It sounds like satire now, but there was a time when lighting up a cigarette was considered a legitimate weight loss strategy, and doctors were on board. In the early to mid-20th century, cigarette companies ran ads that openly promoted smoking as a way to stay slim, with taglines like, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet." This was the golden age of tobacco marketing, and companies were looking for any angle they could find to get more people smoking. Weight loss was the perfect hook, especially for women. In the 1920s and 30s, the flapper era brought a new beauty standard of slim, boyish figures, and cigarette companies seized the opportunity. Some ads even claimed that doctors recommended cigarettes to control appetite. Magazine spreads showed attractive, healthy-looking women smiling with the cigarette in hand, promising that smoking would keep your figure trim. It wasn't just Lucky Strike. Other brands followed suit with slogans like, "Blow yourself thin," and "To keep a slender figure, no one can deny Lucky Strike." And here's the thing. Nicotine really does suppress appetite. People who started smoking often noticed they ate less and lost weight, at least at first. For someone desperate to shed pounds, cigarettes might have seemed like a miracle solution. But of course, there was a deadly downside. The same cigarettes that kept people thin were also quietly wrecking their lungs, hearts, and overall health. By the 1950s, studies were beginning to show a clear link between smoking and lung cancer, emphysema, and heart disease. But for decades before that, people puffed away thinking they were making a healthy choice. It wasn't just about appetite either. Cigarette ads promised that smoking could relieve stress, freshen your breath, yes, really, and make you more glamorous. The weight loss angle was just one part of a much larger campaign to convince people that smoking was practically a health habit. Eventually, as the evidence against cigarettes became undeniable, these ads disappeared. By the 1960s and 70s, the Surgeon General's warnings were appearing on cigarette packs, and the idea of smoking as a health tool became laughable and a little horrifying. Looking back, this is one of the clearest examples of how powerful marketing can be. People trusted doctors, and when they saw medical endorsements of cigarettes, they believed smoking was safe, even good for them. So next time you hear about a new diet hack or appetite suppressant, remember that we once literally encouraged people to inhale carcinogenic smoke as a weight loss strategy. It worked, but at a cost no one would willingly pay today.
corset lung cure claims. We usually think of corsets as just fashion, those stiff, laced-up garments that cinched waists to extreme proportions in the 1800s. But here's the wild part. For a long time, corsets weren't just sold as fashion items. They were endorsed by doctors as medical devices, supposedly good for your lungs, posture, and even digestion. In the Victorian era, there was an entire wave of advertising claiming that wearing a corset could actually cure respiratory problems. The logic, flawed as it was, went like this. By squeezing the waist, the corset forced you to stand up straighter, which supposedly expanded the lungs and allowed you to breathe better. Some ads promised that corsets could prevent tuberculosis, improve circulation, and even make you live longer. Of course, what they were really doing was compressing the ribs and internal organs, sometimes so tightly that women could barely breathe at all. Doctors actually coined the term corset lung to describe the misshapen, constricted lungs found during autopsies of women who had worn tight-laced corsets for years. Instead of helping women breathe, corsets were literally deforming their rib cages. But because the medical understanding of anatomy and disease was limited at the time, many physicians went along with the trend. They prescribed corsets for weak chests, back pain, poor constitution, and even as a way to correct spinal problems in children. Parents were told that lacing up their daughters early would give them not just a beautiful figure, but also a healthier body. And women believed it, or at least felt pressured to. Wearing a corselet was seen as a sign of respectability, so most middle and upper-class women owned several. Some even wore them to bed. The health corsets of the late 19th century were advertised as more comfortable and safer, but they still promoted the same idea that compressing your waist was good for you. The reality, of course, was anything but. Tight lacing could cause fainting, indigestion, and damage to the liver and stomach. Some women even suffered miscarriages from wearing corsets too tightly during pregnancy. Far from being a cure for lung problems, corsets often made breathing shallow and could worsen conditions like asthma or chronic bronchitis. By the early 20th century, as fashion shifted and the dangers of extreme corsetry became more widely known, doctors began warning against the practice. Corset lung became a cautionary term, and eventually the garment fell out of favor as women embraced looser clothing styles. Today, corsets are mostly used for fashion or costume, not health. But the fact that they were once sold as medical devices is a reminder of how easily people can be convinced that something harmful is actually beneficial if an authority figure endorses it. So next time you hear about a trendy waist trainer claiming to improve posture or help with breathing, remember, we've tried this before, and history shows it was anything but healthy.
Chloroform cough syrup. If you think today's cough syrups make you drowsy, wait until you hear about the 19th and early 20th century solution. Chloroform cough syrup. Yes, chloroform, the same chemical used in old detective movies to knock people unconscious with a rag, was once an ingredient you could buy in a bottle at the pharmacy to soothe a sore throat. Chloroform was discovered in the 1830s and quickly became famous as an anesthetic. Surgeons used it to put patients to sleep during operations, and it revolutionized medicine. But soon, pharmacists started experimenting with adding it to syrups and lozenges for ordinary coughs. After all, if it could sedate you for surgery, surely a few drops could calm a tickly throat, right? And it did, sort of. Chloroform is a powerful sedative and numbs the throat almost immediately, so coughing stops. It also makes you feel calm, a little woozy and ready for rest, which probably seemed like a miracle to anyone up all night hacking. But here's the problem. Chloroform also depresses the heart. In small doses, it might just make you sleepy. In larger doses, it can slow your heartbeat dangerously, lower blood pressure, and, in some cases, stop your heart entirely. There are recorded cases of people dying after taking too much chloroform medicine for a stubborn cough, sometimes after just 1 or 2 doses. Children were especially at risk because their smaller bodies couldn't handle even the safe doses that adults took. And because medicine at the time wasn't very precisely measured, there was always the risk of accidental overdose. Despite the risks, chloroform syrups were incredibly popular well into the early 20th century. They were sold under brand names like Chlorodyne and marketed as not only cough suppressants, but also treatments for colic, diarrhea, and insomnia. Imagine having a single bottle in your house that you could use for everything from your baby's teething to your grandfather's hacking cough, and it worked by knocking them out cold. By the 1940s and 50s, as drug regulations got stricter and safer alternatives were developed, like codeine syrups and later dextromethorphan, chloroform began to disappear from over-the-counter medicines. The FDA officially banned its use in human drugs in the 1970s due to its toxicity and possible carcinogenic effects. Today, chloroform lives mostly in pop culture as a cartoonish way to kidnap someone. But for a long time, it was sitting right there in the family medicine cabinet, just 1 teaspoon away from being dangerously unsafe. So the next time you gripe about your cough syrup tasting gross or making you a little sleepy, just be glad it won't put you into an accidental coma or stop your heart. Early medicine was wild, sometimes effective, but often playing a very risky game.
Carbolic acid throat lozenges. Imagine having a sore throat in the late 1800s, walking into the pharmacy and being handed a lozenge made with carbolic acid, also known as phenol, a powerful disinfectant that today you'd use to sterilize surgical instruments, not suck on like candy. Carbolic acid was a breakthrough chemical in medicine. Scottish surgeon Joseph Lister made it famous in the 1860s when he used it to disinfect wounds and surgical tools, dramatically lowering infection rates. This made people see carbolic acid as a miracle substance, something that could kill germs and save lives. Naturally, it didn't take long before someone had the bright idea. If it kills germs on wounds, why not put it in a lozenge to kill the germs in your throat? So, carbolic acid throat lozenges became a thing.
They were marketed as a cure for sore throats, coughs, and even diphtheria. People were encouraged to slowly dissolve them in their mouths, letting the disinfectant bathe the throat. And to be fair, they probably did kill some bacteria, but there was a serious problem. Carbolic acid is corrosive. In high enough concentrations, it can burn tissue, causing blisters, ulcers, and even necrosis. People who used too many lozenges sometimes ended up with painful burns in their mouths and throats. In extreme cases, swallowing too much carbolic acid could lead to systemic poisoning, symptoms like vomiting, kidney damage, and even death. The danger wasn't always obvious at first, because small doses just caused a mild numbing sensation, which made people think it was working. That numbness is actually nerve damage starting to occur. Some patients kept taking them repeatedly throughout the day, not realizing they were slowly harming themselves. Despite the risks, these lozenges remained popular for decades because they were cheap, easy to get, and gave almost immediate relief. Plus, germ theory was still relatively new, so anything that killed germs was seen as high-tech medicine. Eventually, safer antiseptics and milder anesthetics were developed, and carbolic acid lozenges fell out of favor. By the mid-20th century, most countries banned carbolic acid in consumer throat remedies, though it remained in use as a disinfectant in hospitals and cleaning products. Today, the idea of sucking on a lozenge made of the same chemical used to sterilize operating rooms sounds absurd and a little terrifying. But back then, it was just one more example of the kill the germs at any cost approach to medicine, even if it meant burning your throat in the process. So, the next time you pop a cherry-flavored cough drop, be grateful that modern lozenges only soothe your throat, not dissolve it. Our ancestors were willing to put some pretty scary stuff in their bodies for the promise of relief.
Formaldehyde Fumigators. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s. There's a flu outbreak in your town, and the local pharmacy is selling little devices that promise to protect your entire family. All you have to do is light them, set them in a room, and breathe in the fumes. Congratulations! You've just filled your house with formaldehyde gas. Yes, formaldehyde, the same chemical used today to preserve dead bodies and disinfect lab equipment, was once marketed as a home flu prevention tool. These products, often called formaldehyde fumigators or disinfectant candles, were sold in hardware stores, pharmacies, and even mailed door-to-door during epidemics. The idea was simple. Formaldehyde kills germs on contact. So if you filled your living space with a low-level cloud of formaldehyde gas, you could sterilize the air, kill viruses and bacteria, and keep your family safe from infectious diseases. In theory, that sounded brilliant. Who wouldn't want a germ-free home during a flu outbreak? But here's the problem. Formaldehyde is highly toxic. Breathing it in irritates the eyes, nose, and throat, and prolonged exposure can damage the lungs. People who used these fumigators often reported burning eyes, coughing fits, and headaches. In some cases, children and elderly family members became violently ill after sitting in a room that had been disinfected. Despite these risks, formaldehyde fumigation became hugely popular during the 1918 flu pandemic.
Public health officials were desperate for solutions, and the science of airborne disease transmission was still developing. Doctors sometimes even recommended fumigating schools, churches, and entire train cars with formaldehyde to stop the spread of illness, turning public spaces into giant chemical chambers. Of course, formaldehyde wasn't selective. It killed germs, yes, but it also burned the lining of people's lungs and could cause chemical pneumonia if inhaled in high concentrations. There are records of hospital patients accidentally being poisoned when too much formaldehyde was used to sterilize their rooms. By the mid-20th century, as medicine advanced and vaccines became available, formaldehyde fumigation fell out of favor. Better ventilation systems, germ theory, and an understanding of how respiratory diseases actually spread made it clear that filling homes with toxic gas was not exactly the safest approach. Today, formaldehyde is still used in controlled settings, like in labs and funeral homes. But the idea of lighting a formaldehyde candle in your living room to keep the flu away feels like something out of a dystopian novel. So, next time you plug in an air purifier or spray a little disinfectant around the house, take a moment to be thankful you don't have to gas your entire home with something that doubles as embalming fluid just to feel safe. Our ancestors were tough, but sometimes they were also just playing chemist in ways that make us shudder today.
Borax baby powder. When we think of baby powder today, we picture something gentle, soft, soothing, maybe even with that classic baby smell. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, some baby powders contained borax, a chemical compound that, while useful for cleaning your laundry, is definitely not something you want all over an infant's skin. Borax, sodium borate, was prized back then as a disinfectant and preservative. People believed it could keep skin clean, prevent rashes, and stop infections. So companies started adding it to baby powders and selling it as the perfect solution for diaper rash, chafing, and keeping baby fresh. The ads were persuasive. They showed happy, healthy babies being lovingly dusted with powder, promising mothers that this would keep their children comfortable and free from irritation. It was marketed as modern science, a step up from old-fashioned remedies. But here's the dark truth. Borax is toxic, especially for infants. It can be absorbed through the skin, and babies have much thinner, more sensitive skin than adults. Symptoms of borax poisoning can include vomiting, diarrhea, skin peeling, seizures, and in severe cases, death. And because people were encouraged to use it liberally, sometimes multiple times a day, babies could be exposed to dangerous levels without anyone realizing what was happening. There are heartbreaking historical accounts of infants who became gravely ill after repeated exposure to borax-laced powders. At the time, the connection wasn't always obvious, and some doctors even recommended continuing to use the powder, thinking the symptoms were caused by infection rather than the product meant to prevent it. The problem wasn't just with powders either. Borax was also added to some baby soaps, ointments, and even certain foods as a preservative.
For a while, it was seen as a wonder chemical, the solution to spoilage, germs, and bad smells. Eventually, as medical science improved, researchers discovered just how dangerous borax could be when ingested or absorbed through the skin. By the mid-20th century, regulations began to restrict its use in products meant for children. Baby powders were reformulated with safer ingredients like talc or cornstarch, though talc would later come under its own controversy for other reasons. Today, borax is used mainly as a cleaning product or in crafts like slime making, and it comes with plenty of warning labels. The idea of sprinkling it all over a baby's delicate skin is unthinkable now. But back then, parents were just trying to do what was best with the information they had. It's a sobering reminder of how even something as innocent as baby powder can be dangerous if we don't fully understand the ingredients. So the next time you see gentle or safe for babies on a label, be glad that modern regulations exist to make sure it actually means what it says.
Lead-based teething rings. Teething is rough, babies and parents. These days, we have safe silicone teething rings, frozen washcloths, and pediatrician-approved gels to help little ones through the pain. But a century ago, the solution was lead. Yes, many early teething rings, rattles, and pacifier-like toys were made from lead or painted with lead-based paint, meaning they slowly leached poison right into babies' mouths. Lead was everywhere in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was cheap, easy to shape, and considered a safe metal for household use. Toy makers used it for everything from rattles to toy soldiers to painted blocks. Some teething rings were made entirely of soft lead, which could be molded into cute animal shapes or shiny hoops perfect for babies to gnaw on. The logic at the time was simple. Lead was smooth, durable, and heavy enough to feel quality. Plus, it stayed cool to the touch, which was considered soothing for sore gums. It seemed like the perfect material, until you remember that lead is a neurotoxin. When babies chewed on lead rings, tiny amounts of the metal would leach into their saliva and be swallowed. Over time, this could cause lead poisoning, leading to developmental delays, seizures, anemia, and in severe cases, death. But in the early 1900s, parents and doctors didn't yet understand the dangers of chronic lead exposure. If a child became sickly or irritable, it was often blamed on teething fever or other unrelated causes. Even after scientists began linking lead exposure to developmental issues in children, it took decades for public health campaigns to catch up. Lead-based paints and toys continued to be sold well into the mid-20th century, and many children suffered lifelong consequences from exposure during their most vulnerable years. What's truly shocking is how normalized it was. Ads for lead teething rings proudly highlighted their shine and durability, encouraging parents to let their babies chew on them all day. Some were even filled with liquid mercury to make them double as rattles, a true toxic cocktail of early childhood entertainment. By the 1970s and 80s, after overwhelming evidence of lead's toxicity,
Strict regulations finally banned lead from consumer products like toys, paints, and teething rings. But the damage was done. Generations of children had been exposed. Today, lead exposure is taken very seriously, and parents are warned to be careful even with imported toys or vintage baby items that might still contain lead. The idea of handing a baby a literal piece of lead to chew on now sounds absurd, but for decades it was just good parenting. So next time you see a modern teething ring made of soft, BPA-free silicone, take a moment to be grateful that science and regulation have turned something once dangerous into something truly safe. Because history proves that sometimes the classic solution was secretly the most harmful of all.
Coal tar cough syrup. If you've ever had a bad cough, you know how desperate you can get for relief. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, one of the hottest solutions on the market was coal tar cough syrup. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Medicine derived from the byproducts of burning coal. Coal tar was considered a miracle substance back then. It was cheap, plentiful, and used to make all sorts of things: dyes, disinfectants, and even the first synthetic medications. Chemists discovered that certain compounds from coal tar could act as expectorants, helping to thin mucus and make coughing more productive. So naturally, they put it into syrups and sold it as a cure for everything from chest colds to bronchitis. These syrups worked, in a way. They often contained ingredients like creosote, phenol, or guaiacol, all coal tar derivatives, that did help loosen mucus and calm inflammation. Patients would report relief after taking them, and because these medicines often contained alcohol as well, they felt warm, drowsy, and soothed. But here's the dark side. Coal tar is full of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, many of which we now know are carcinogenic. Repeated exposure to coal tar products has been linked to skin, lung, and bladder cancers. People taking coal tar cough syrups weren't just soothing their throats, they were slowly dosing themselves with cancer-causing chemicals. Even more disturbing is that these syrups were often given to children. Ads encouraged parents to give them to restless little ones to help them sleep through a cough. No one at the time knew they were potentially setting those kids up for long-term health problems. Coal tar wasn't just in cough syrup either. It was in lozenges, throat sprays, and even chewing gum. It was everywhere, sold under respectable brand names that promised scientific relief. Eventually, as medical research advanced in the 20th century, concerns about coal tar's safety began to grow. Safer synthetic expectorants like guaifenesin were developed, which didn't carry the same cancer risk. By the mid-20th century, coal tar cough syrups were largely phased out, though coal tar is still used today in some medicated shampoos and skin creams, in much more controlled doses. Looking back, coal tar cough syrups are a perfect example of early medicine's "if it works, it must be good" philosophy, even if it came from something as dirty and industrial as coal. People were so desperate for relief from illness that they didn't ask too many questions about what was actually in the bottle. So next time you take a cherry-flavored cough syrup and complain about the taste, be grateful it doesn't come with a side of cancer risk, and that you don't have to drink something that smells faintly like a railroad yard just to get through the night. Soda form health waters. Before soda became the sweet, bubbly treat we know today, it was marketed as medicine. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, health waters and tonics were all the rage, and they were often laced with ingredients that, in hindsight, are pretty alarming. We're talking lithium, bromides, and even radium, all served up in a refreshing fizzy drink. People back then believed that natural mineral springs had healing powers. If you couldn't make it to a fancy spa town, you could buy bottled mineral water that promised to cure headaches, calm your nerves, and restore vitality. When soda fountains became popular, pharmacists and entrepreneurs started carbonating these waters and selling them as daily tonics. Some of the most famous early sodas contained active medical ingredients. For example, lithium water was advertised as a mood stabilizer, brain tonic, and hangover cure. In fact, the soft drink 7-Up originally contained lithium citrate when it launched in 1929. Its original name was bib-label lithiated lemon lime soda. People were literally microdosing a psychiatric drug with every glass. Bromide-laced waters were sold to treat anxiety, insomnia, and nervous conditions. The bromides did calm people down, but chronic use could lead to bromism, a kind of poisoning that caused mental fog, rashes, and psychosis. And yes, there were even radium waters sold as energy drinks. Radium was considered a wonder element after its discovery, and companies marketed it as a way to invigorate the blood and increase stamina. Some of these drinks literally glowed in the dark thanks to the radioactive material inside, which was considered a selling point. At first, people swore by these curative drinks. They really did seem to boost mood, reduce pain, or give a sense of energy, mostly because they were delivering powerful drugs or radiation directly into the body. But the side effects could be devastating. Lithium could cause tremors and kidney damage at higher doses. Bromides could lead to neurological problems, and radium, well, we know what radiation does after enough exposure. Perhaps the most infamous case was Radithor, a radium-infused water that became popular among wealthy elites in the 1920s. One high-profile customer, industrialist Eben Byers, drank bottle after bottle every day until he died painfully from radiation poisoning, his bones literally disintegrating. By the mid-20th century, as drug regulations tightened and the dangers of these ingredients became clear, most of these health waters were reformulated to remove the active drugs. 7-Up quietly dropped lithium in 1948. Bromide drinks disappeared, and radium beverages were banned entirely. Today, we still love functional beverages, energy drinks, vitamin waters, adaptogen tonics, but they're far less extreme than the drug-laced sodas of a century ago. It's wild to think that grabbing a fizzy drink back then could mean you were dosing yourself with a mild sedative, a psychiatric medication, or actual radiation.
Cigarette smoking as asthma treatment. It sounds completely backward today, But there was a time when doctors actually recommended smoking to treat asthma. Yes, they encouraged people who were struggling to breathe to light up and inhale smoke as medicine. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, asthma was poorly understood. Doctors knew it involved constricted airways, but they didn't have modern inhalers, steroids, or bronchodilators to help patients. So they turned to something that had been used for centuries: burning herbs and inhaling the smoke to clear the lungs. Early asthma cigarettes were made with ingredients like stramonium, a plant related to deadly nightshade, belladonna, and sometimes even opium. These substances acted as muscle relaxants, and when burned, they could temporarily dilate the airways, giving short-lived relief. Pharmacies sold ready-made asthma cigarettes, and advertisements promised that smoking them would stop wheezing and coughing almost instantly. Some brands even marketed themselves as safe for children. There were also powders and pastilles meant to be burned on a dish, allowing patients to inhale the smoke in a room filled with the fumes, like turning your house into a mini smoke chamber. When commercial tobacco cigarettes became more popular, some doctors simply suggested their patients smoke those instead, claiming the warm smoke soothed the lungs. For a while, this became a common recommendation, and cigarette companies happily jumped on the marketing opportunity. But here's the dark side. While some of these herbal cigarettes may have provided brief relief, they were also irritating the lungs and delivering toxic compounds with every puff. Over time, they could actually make asthma symptoms worse. And if you switched to regular tobacco cigarettes, you were also exposing yourself to nicotine addiction, emphysema, and lung cancer risks, the exact opposite of what someone with breathing problems needed. There are recorded cases of children with asthma being given cigarettes by their parents on doctor's orders, which is horrifying to imagine now. Some adults became lifelong smokers because they started using asthma cigarettes in their youth and got hooked on the habit. By the mid-20th century, as the dangers of smoking became clearer and real asthma medications were developed, this practice quickly fell out of favor. Inhalers containing epinephrine, or later albuterol, offered a much safer, more targeted way to open the airways without filling the lungs with smoke. Today, the idea of recommending cigarettes for someone with asthma sounds absurd, like telling someone with a peanut allergy to eat a handful of peanuts to build tolerance. But a century ago, this was considered cutting-edge therapy. So the next time you take a deep, easy breath thanks to a quick inhaler puff, take a moment to be grateful you don't have to sit in a smoky room hoping the next cigarette will stop your wheezing instead of making it worse. Hydrotherapy, restraint baths. When we hear the word hydrotherapy today, we think of relaxing spas, warm baths, and gentle stress relief. But in early psychiatric hospitals, hydrotherapy wasn't a luxury. It was a treatment for mental illness that often looked more like punishment than care. Starting in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century, asylums used hydrotherapy baths as a way to treat patients with everything from schizophrenia to depression to nervous exhaustion. The idea was that water could calm the mind, regulate emotions, and restore balance. At first, this might sound nice.
a warm bath to soothe agitation, but the practice quickly took on a darker tone. Many hospitals used restraint tubs, large, deep tubs filled with warm water where patients were placed for hours, sometimes even days at a time. Their bodies were wrapped in sheets or stropped under canvas covers so they couldn't climb out. The belief was that long immersion in warm water would sedate overstimulated patients, while cold water could shock withdrawn or catatonic patients back into responsiveness. Some treatments involved alternating between hot and cold baths as a way of resetting the nervous system. Reports from the time describe patients left in tubs for 12, 24, or even 48 hours straight, with attendants checking in only occasionally to change the water temperature or bring food and bedpans. The goal wasn't just hygiene, it was complete control of the patient's behavior. For some, it may have provided a sense of calm or relief from overwhelming emotions, but for many others, it was terrifying. Being stropped into a bath for hours at a time could feel like imprisonment. Patients sometimes panicked, struggled, or even passed out during these treatments. And if cold water immersion was used, it could be downright torturous. Imagine being dunked into icy water while being told it was for your own good. Doctors believed they were being humane compared to the older methods of straitjackets or isolation cells. But in practice, hydrotherapy often functioned as a form of restraint disguised as medicine. It kept patients docile and manageable, which was as much a benefit to the hospital staff as to the patient. By the mid-20th century, with the rise of psychiatric medications, hydrotherapy baths began to disappear from asylums. The focus shifted toward drug therapy and talk therapy, and the idea of restraining patients in water for hours started to look less therapeutic and more like abuse. Today, hydrotherapy survives in a gentler form. Spas, hot tubs, and even sensory deprivation tanks. But the days of the restraint bath are thankfully behind us. So next time you step into a warm bath to relax, just imagine what it would have been like to be forced to stay there for 24 hours straight, strapped down, with no choice but to soak until someone decided you'd had enough therapy.